Close your eyes if you like. There is nowhere to be but here, and nothing to do but listen. The desert holds its heat long after the sun is gone. The rocks release it slowly, the way a story releases its meaning slowly, one quiet layer at a time. Nothing moves, and then something does. A shape unfolds from the shadow between two stones. Heavy, patient, patterned in black and burnt orange, in no hurry at all. A Gila monster. It has not eaten in weeks. It may not eat again for months. And yet, somewhere inside its mouth, in a substance most people would go out of their way to avoid, there is a molecule that would one day help scientists rethink how the human body controls blood sugar, hunger, and the way it responds to food. Not because anyone was searching for it, not because anyone imagined a medicine cabinet or a pharmacy shelf or a refrigerator door closing quietly in someone's kitchen thousands of miles from this desert. At first, this was only biology, a slow animal, a strange chemistry, a question nobody was being paid to ask. But questions like that have a way of outliving the moment they were asked in. Before there was Ozempic, there was a lizard, and to understand one, we have to begin patiently with the other. The Sonoran Desert does not look like a place built for patience. It looks like a place built for survival. The kind that is fast, brutal, and over quickly. Heat that presses down instead of falling. Ground the color of old bone. Plants that seem to have given up on softness entirely, replacing it with thorns. By midday, the temperature here can climb well past 100 degrees. And almost everything with a choice in the matter has already made it. Gone underground, gone still, gone quiet until the worst of the heat has passed. The air above the ground shimmers, bending the horizon into something that looks almost liquid. Very little moves, very little is willing to spend the energy moving would cost. And yet patience is exactly what this landscape teaches, if you know how to watch for it. Somewhere beneath a shelf of sandstone, in a burrow it may have used for years, a Gila monster is doing nothing at all. It is not hunting, it is not moving. It has, by most reasonable measures, no urgent reason to do anything today, or tomorrow, or for a long while after that. It is simply waiting, the way it has always waited, the way its ancestors waited millions of years before the first human ever crossed this stretch of ground. When it does emerge, usually in the cool hours of morning or after a rare desert rain, it moves the way a held breath moves, slowly, deliberately. As if speed were a resource, it has decided, quite reasonably, not to waste. Its top walking speed is barely faster than a person's unhurried stroll. It does not chase. It has never needed to. There is a particular kind of confidence in that. Most animals that move slowly are prey, built that way because something faster hasn't found a reason to eat them yet, or because they have nowhere left to run and have simply stopped trying. The Gila monster is different. It moves slowly because almost nothing in this desert is foolish enough to test it. It has earned its unhurried pace. It has nothing left to prove. Heloderma suspectum. The name comes from Greek, studded skin. And it is exactly right. The Gila monster's body is covered not in ordinary scales, but in small bony beads called osteoderms, embedded in the skin itself, like a coat of ancient armor. Black, burnt orange, sometimes pink. The pattern is not camouflage. It is a warning, worn openly, the way a wasp's stripes are a warning. Bright enough that most predators learn, quickly and permanently, to leave this animal alone. It grows to about 20 inches, sometimes more. It is the largest lizard native to the United States. And for something so heavy-bodied and so visible when it finally does appear, It spends an almost unbelievable portion of its life completely out of sight. Field studies place the number near 95%. 95% of its existence spent underground, in darkness, in stillness, waiting. Most people who live their entire lives near Gila monster territory will never see one. Not because the animal is rare. Its population, while protected, is stable across much of its range, but because it has simply mastered the art of not being seen. It emerges briefly in spring, during the short window when mating and feeding both happen in something close to overlap. And then it is gone again, back into the rock and the dark, for months at a time. An entire life, mostly lived out of view, mostly still. And it lives a long time doing it. In the wild, 20 years is unremarkable for a Gila monster. In captivity, individuals have been documented living past 30, occasionally closer to 36. Slowness, it turns out, is not a liability here. It may be part of the reason this animal endures as long as it does. A body that spends so little of itself on urgency has correspondingly little left over to wear down. Waiting for what exactly? For a very particular kind of opportunity. A bird's nest raided for eggs, a newborn rabbit still blind and defenseless, a clutch of quail eggs, small and pale, swallowed almost whole. These are not everyday meals. In the wild, a Gila monster may eat only 4 or 5 times in an entire year. 4 or 5 meals, and then months, sometimes the better part of a year, of nothing at all. Think about what that actually requires of a body. Most animals, most humans, operate on a rhythm of near constant replenishment. We eat, we digest, we run low, we eat again, usually within hours. And our biology has been shaped by that rhythm for as long as our species has existed. Blood sugar rises and falls in a tight, closely managed range, propped up by a body that assumes food is coming again soon, because for most of evolutionary history, it usually was. The Gila monster made a different bet. It bet on scarcity. It bet that food would be rare, unpredictable, and sometimes absent for the better part of a year. And rather than fighting that reality, rather than evolving to search harder or move faster or compete more aggressively for the little that was available, it built a body that simply didn't need to. A body that could win comfortably on the terms the desert actually offered instead of the terms most animals wish they had. That is worth sitting with for a moment because it is easy to miss. We tend to admire adaptation that looks like effort, the predator that runs faster, the migration that covers thousands of miles, the burst of speed at exactly the right instant. The Gila monster's adaptation looks like almost nothing at all. It looks like doing very little, very well, for a very long time. And in a landscape, this unforgiving, doing very little very well, turns out to be one of the hardest things of all to master. When it finds a meal, it does not eat modestly. It gorges, sometimes consuming close to 1/3 of its own body weight in a single sitting, occasionally more in younger individuals still building their reserves. Imagine, for a moment, sitting down to a meal equal to 1/3 of your own weight, and then not eating again for the better part of a year. For almost any other creature, this would be a catastrophe. For the Gila monster, it is simply Tuesday. The secret is in the tail, thick, blunt, unmistakable. The Gila monster's tail is not primarily for balance or defense. It is a pantry, a reservoir, fat stored there after every rare meal, metabolized slowly across the long months that follow. Herpetologists checking on a Gila monster's health in the wild will sometimes measure the thickness of that tail, because a healthy tail means a healthy animal, and a thin one means trouble is coming. The tail is quite literally a fuel gauge for an animal that has learned to run on almost nothing for almost forever. A thin tail, a fat tail, life or the slow approach of its opposite. Measured in a single, unglamorous body part, most people would never think to look at twice. And when the cold months arrive, it goes further still, dropping into a state called brumation, the reptile equivalent of hibernation. Its heart rate slows, its breathing slows. Whatever urgency an animal might normally carry through a season simply switches off, replaced by something closer to suspension. The fat in that tail becomes the only thing standing between the animal and starvation, rationed out so precisely across the weeks of stillness that by the time spring finally arrives, there is usually just enough left to begin again. No meal plan, no refrigerator, no emergency store of food buried nearby. Just a body that had already solved, millions of years ago, a problem we are still, in our own way, trying to solve today. There is a term herpetologists sometimes use for this kind of strategy: capital breeding, capital survival, living off a stockpile built in advance, rather than off whatever happens to be available today. Most desert animals are, to some degree, income earners. They need a more or less steady trickle of resources coming in, and when that trickle stops, trouble follows quickly. The Gila monster is closer to something else entirely. An animal that makes a handful of enormous deposits each year and then draws down against them, slowly, carefully, for months at a time. It does not live meal to meal. It lives season to season, sometimes year to year, on reserves most animals could never build and could never survive on if they did. There is something worth sitting with here before we move any further into this story. We tend to think of survival as a matter of strength, or speed, or aggression, the fastest predator, the sharpest claws, the most ferocious bite. But the Gila monster survives through none of those things. It survives through chemistry, through the quiet, invisible discipline of a metabolism that knows exactly how to stretch one meal across an entire season. That is not a small thing. That is, in its own way, one of the more elegant solutions evolution has ever produced. Before we continue, if these slow, quiet journeys into the stranger corners of history are helping you unwind tonight, you're welcome to hit subscribe. Not urgently, not right this second, just whenever it feels natural. It helps this kind of story keep finding its way to people who need somewhere calm to land at the end of the day. Then let's go back into the dark and back into the desert. Because there is one more thing about this animal that we haven't discussed yet. The thing that made it, of all the creatures in this desert, the one that would eventually matter to medicine: its bite. The Gila monster is one of only a small handful of venomous lizards on the planet. But its venom does not work the way most people imagine venom working. There are no hollow fangs here, no hypodermic-style injection the way a rattlesnake delivers its venom in a single decisive strike. Instead, the venom is produced in modified glands along the lower jaw and delivered almost mechanically, through small grooves cut into several of its teeth, worked into a wound as the animal chews. Not a strike, a grip. The Gila monster has to clamp down and hold on, sometimes for minutes at a time, for its venom to do its work at all. And its work, curiously, is mostly defensive. Its usual prey, eggs, nestlings, nearly helpless newborns, doesn't fight back. It doesn't need venom to overpower them. The bite exists, most researchers believe, primarily to discourage the coyotes, hawks, and other predators that might otherwise be tempted to make a meal of the Gila monster itself. Imagine, for a moment, being on the receiving end of it. Not a puncture, not a quick strike and release, a slow, deliberate clamp, the jaw locking down and simply refusing to let go, sometimes for minutes at a stretch, while the venom works its way in along the grooves of the teeth. There is nothing fast about it. Even in self-defense, this animal does things at its own unhurried pace. A bite from one is, by every account, extraordinarily painful, described by those unlucky enough to experience it as something like fire moving under the skin. But for all its reputation, no confirmed human death has ever been recorded from one. That reputation, it should be said, is mostly fiction. For over a century, this animal has been burdened with legends far stranger than anything it actually does. Some early accounts insisted it could leap several feet through the air to attack a grown man. Others claimed its breath alone was poisonous. That simply standing near one, without ever being touched, was enough to fall ill. There were stories of a venomous sting hidden in its tongue, and stories of a bite so certainly fatal that entire communities treated any sighting as an emergency. None of it was true. What was true, what people overlooked for decades, distracted by the fear, was something happening quietly inside its mouth, in the venom itself, that had nothing to do with killing anything at all. By the middle of the 20th century, the Gila monster had become the first venomous animal in North America to receive formal legal protection in the state of Arizona in 1952. Not because anyone yet understood what its venom might someday mean for human medicine, but simply because a slow-moving, misunderstood desert lizard had, quite unfairly, been hunted and killed out of fear for generations. It was protected first for what it was assumed not to be worth. Its real worth was still sitting, unnoticed, in its saliva. Here is where the story begins to turn. In the early 1980s, researchers at the National Institutes of Health, studying venom from snakes and lizards for reasons that had nothing to do with diabetes or obesity, noticed something unusual. In some animals, the venom seemed to be doing something to the pancreas, the organ responsible for producing insulin. It appeared to be stimulating it, almost overstimulating it, in ways that didn't fit neatly into anyone's existing understanding of what venom was supposed to do. It was a strange, easily overlooked detail, the kind of observation that gets published quietly, cited a handful of times, and then mostly forgotten, filed away in a journal that very few people outside a narrow specialty would ever read. No headline followed it, no press conference, just a small, technical note sitting in the scientific record, waiting for someone with the right question to stumble across it. But somewhere, years later, one endocrinologist would read it, and he would remember it, not because he was looking for a breakthrough, and certainly not because he was looking for a weight loss drug that didn't yet exist and wouldn't for decades. He would remember it because of a question that had nothing, on the surface, to do with any of that. A question about a lizard that could go months without eating, and somehow, through all of it, never lose control of its own blood sugar. Because that, in the end, is the part that should stop us. Most bodies, human bodies especially, depend on a fairly narrow, fairly fragile balance of blood glucose. Too low, and the brain begins to falter within minutes. Too high for too long, and the damage compounds quietly for years. The slow, grinding hum that defines a disease like diabetes. We spend enormous medical effort simply keeping that one number inside a safe, narrow range several times a day for an entire lifetime. The Gila monster does something that should, by every conventional expectation, be far harder. It goes without food entirely, for weeks, for months, and its blood sugar does not spiral out of control. It does not crash. It does not spike. Somehow, in the absence of the very thing most bodies depend on to regulate that balance, this animal's body regulates it anyway. How? That is where we're going next. Not into a laboratory yet, not into a boardroom, not anywhere near a pharmacy shelf. Just into the quiet, unglamorous space where one clinician's curiosity was about to meet a peptide that had been waiting patiently inside a desert lizard's mouth for longer than anyone had bothered to ask why. The desert doesn't rush. Neither should we. Let's leave the desert for a moment, not far, not for long. Just far enough to look at something happening inside a much more familiar body, yours or mine or anyone's, at almost any meal, on almost any ordinary day. Picture an evening meal, nothing special, just dinner, eaten the way most dinners are eaten, without a second thought given to the machinery working underneath it. The fork lifts, the food is chewed, swallowed, sent down toward a stomach that has been quietly anticipating its arrival since the first bite touched the tongue. And somewhere in that unremarkable sequence, so far beneath conscious awareness that you would need laboratory instruments to detect it at all, one of the most consequential biochemical conversations in the human body has already begun. You eat something, it doesn't matter what. Within minutes, before the food has even finished making its way through your stomach, a quiet signal is already moving through your body. Not loud, not something you'd ever notice, but precise and immediate and remarkably well-timed. Cells lining your small intestine, sensing the arrival of food, release a hormone into your bloodstream. It travels only a short distance before it starts doing its work. It reaches your pancreas and tells it, gently but clearly, that insulin is needed now. But only if blood sugar is actually elevated, not as a blanket instruction, not as a blunt command, but as something closer to a careful, conditional suggestion. It reaches the part of the pancreas responsible for glucagon, the hormone that raises blood sugar, and tells it to stand down for the moment so the two signals aren't working against each other. It reaches the stomach itself and asks it to slow down, to release its contents more gradually, so that sugar doesn't flood the bloodstream all at once. And somewhere, in a part of the brain involved in appetite, it leaves behind a quiet suggestion that you have had enough. That last effect deserves a moment of its own, because it is easy to read past it too quickly. This is not willpower being summoned from somewhere. It is not a conscious decision to stop eating arrived at through discipline or restraint. It is a hormonal signal arriving in a part of the brain that operates largely below conscious thought, adjusting gently, chemically, the felt sense of hunger itself. Long before anyone understood the mechanism, people simply described the feeling GLP-1 produces as a kind of quiet, the absence of the low, persistent hum of thinking about food that so many people carry through an ordinary day without ever naming it. GLP-1, it turns out, was never just a hormone about blood sugar. It was, from the very beginning, a hormone about attention, quietly deciding how much of your mind food is allowed to occupy. All of that, from one hormone, released automatically, adjusted precisely, gone again almost as quickly as it arrived. This hormone has a name, glucagon-like peptide 1, or GLP-1 for short. But the name matters far less than what it actually does. It is, in the simplest possible terms, one of the body's own internal answers to a question that has occupied doctors and researchers for well over a century. How do you keep blood sugar inside a safe, narrow range, meal after meal, day after day, for an entire lifetime, without either starving the cells that need glucose or flooding the bloodstream with more than the body can safely handle? GLP-1 belongs to a family of hormones called incretins, signals released by the gut specifically in response to eating, whose entire purpose is to prepare the rest of the body for the meal that's already arriving. Researchers had noticed decades earlier something curious. Glucose taken by mouth triggers a much larger insulin response than the exact same amount of glucose delivered directly into the bloodstream. Something about the act of eating itself, not just the sugar, but the eating, was amplifying the body's response. For years, that amplification was a phenomenon without a clear explanation. GLP-1, once identified, became a major part of that explanation. This idea that the gut itself might be a kind of endocrine organ, quietly issuing instructions to the rest of the body, was not new. By the early 20th century, physiologists had already begun to suspect that digestion involved more than mechanics and acid. They had already identified other gut hormones behaving in similarly conversational ways, chemical messengers released by the intestine that traveled elsewhere in the body to prepare other organs for what was coming. The idea that eating itself might trigger a cascade of hormonal signaling, not just one hormone, but an entire coordinated system of them, took decades to fully map. GLP-1 was one of the last, and in many ways, one of the most important pieces of that puzzle to fall into place. And it does its job with a kind of precision that, the more closely you look at it, starts to feel almost elegant. It doesn't simply flood the body with insulin the way an injection might. It only prompts insulin release when blood glucose is already elevated, a built-in safety mechanism that makes a dangerous crash in blood sugar far less likely than it would be with a blunter tool. It doesn't just slow digestion arbitrarily, it slows it in proportion to what's needed, giving the rest of the body time to catch up with what's arriving. It doesn't just suppress appetite outright, it nudges it quietly, the way a hand might rest gently on your shoulder rather than pull you back by force. This is not a crude signal. This is closer to a finely tuned instrument, a hormone that seems to understand, almost intuitively, exactly how much correction a given moment requires, and no more. Which raises an obvious question. If the human body already has something this well designed, something this precise, something that already does nearly everything doctors spend their careers trying to help diabetic patients achieve manually, why isn't it simply enough? Why do millions of people still need insulin injections, oral medications, careful monitoring, a lifetime of vigilance, if the answer was sitting inside their own intestines the entire time? Here is where the story turns, quietly, from admiration into frustration. GLP-1 is not rare. It is not exotic. The body makes it every time you eat, faithfully, automatically, without you ever noticing. But it is fragile, devastatingly fragile in a pharmacological sense. Almost the instant it's released into the bloodstream, an enzyme called dipeptidyl peptidase 4, DPP4 for short, begins taking it apart, clipping it, disassembling it, piece by piece with ruthless efficiency. The half-life of natural human GLP-1 in the bloodstream is measured not in hours, not even in tens of minutes, but in a minute or two. Sometimes less. There is nothing dramatic about DPP-4 itself. It isn't malicious, isn't a disease, isn't a malfunction of any kind. It is simply doing exactly what it evolved to do, patrolling the bloodstream, clipping short peptide chains as a matter of routine housekeeping, the same way it treats a great many other small signaling molecules that pass through. GLP-1 is not being singled out. It is simply one more small short peptide in a bloodstream full of enzymes whose entire job is to make sure nothing lingers longer than it should. The tragedy, if you can call it that, is one of proportion. An enzyme doing its job perfectly on a hormone that happened to need more time than that job allowed. Picture a message written in the sand at the edge of the tide. It says exactly what it needs to say clearly, at the exact right moment. And then the water comes in and it's gone, as though it had never been written at all. That is GLP-1, a hormone that does almost everything right, and then disappears before anyone downstream has time to fully benefit from it. And the stakes of solving that problem were never small. Type 2 diabetes was not, by the later decades of the 20th century, a rare or minor condition. It was already one of the most widespread chronic illnesses in the world, quietly shortening lives and complicating them in ways that rarely made headlines. Nerve damage that crept in slowly, vision that dimmed over years rather than days, hearts and kidneys placed under a strain that accumulated so gradually, most patients barely noticed until real damage had already been done. Millions of people were managing it, imperfectly, with the tools available at the time. Oral medications with limited precision, insulin injections that came with their own serious risk of overcorrection and dangerously low blood sugar. A therapy that could restore the body's own natural glucose-dependent regulation, rather than simply overriding it from the outside, wasn't just a scientific curiosity. It was something entire medical communities were quietly desperate for. It didn't take researchers long to understand why the body might have built it this way. A signal, this powerful, one capable of triggering insulin release, suppressing glucagon, slowing digestion, and quieting appetite all at once, is not something you would want lingering indefinitely. Hormonal systems generally need an off switch every bit as much as they need an on switch. A message that never fades risks becoming a message the body stops listening to altogether. Or worse, one that keeps pushing long after its job is finished. In a sense, GLP-1's short life isn't a flaw at all. It's a feature. It's precisely engineered restraint. But restraint that useful, that precise, is exactly what makes a poor foundation for medicine. Because think about what a drug based on GLP-1 would actually require if it worked the way GLP-1 naturally does. You would need to somehow keep the hormone circulating in a person's bloodstream continuously, or close to it. Not for 2 minutes, but for hours, ideally longer, so that its careful, glucose-dependent effects could accumulate across an entire day, across the gaps between meals, across sleep, across ordinary life. And yet the moment you introduced more of the natural hormone into the body, the same enzyme that was already breaking it down within minutes would simply do exactly what it always does. Break it down within minutes, no matter how much you gave, no matter how often. It was, in a very real sense, a solved problem and an unsolved problem occupying the exact same molecule. By the second half of the 20th century, Researchers studying diabetes understood the shape of GLP-1's promise with real clarity. Type 2 diabetes, at its core, often involves a breakdown in exactly the systems GLP-1 was built to support. Insulin release that's blunted or mistimed. Glucagon that doesn't quiet down when it should. A body that has lost some of its natural precision in managing blood sugar. A therapy that could restore that precision, rather than simply overriding it with external insulin, felt less like treating a disease from the outside and more like handing the body back a tool it had already invented for itself, but could no longer use effectively on its own. The dream, in other words, wasn't a new hormone. It was a version of the old one that simply refused to disappear. And so in laboratories scattered across the world, some prestigious, well-funded, chasing exactly this goal on purpose, others small, obscure, stumbling toward pieces of the answer almost by accident, a quiet search began. Chemists tried modifying the GLP-1 molecule directly, adjusting its structure in small ways, hoping to slip past DPP-4's notice without losing the hormone's essential function. It was delicate, frustrating work, changed too little, and the enzyme still recognized and destroyed the molecule within minutes. Changed too much, and the molecule stopped behaving like GLP-1 at all, losing the very properties that made it worth pursuing in the first place. Others looked further afield entirely, at unrelated peptides, at unrelated hormone systems, hoping to find something in nature that already resembled GLP-1's function, but had, for whatever evolutionary reason, been built to last. Some of this research unfolded exactly the way science is popularly imagined: hypothesis, experiment, careful incremental progress toward a known goal. But a great deal of it unfolded the way most real discovery actually happens, sideways. Researchers studying entirely unrelated questions, venom toxicity, digestive physiology, the pharmacology of unfamiliar animals, occasionally stumbled across small, strange observations that seemed only distantly related to diabetes, if related at all. Most such observations went nowhere. They were published, noted, and largely forgotten. Footnotes in journals that only a handful of specialists would ever read closely. None of it converged quickly. This was not a race with a clear finish line in sight, more a slow, scattered, largely unglamorous accumulation of dead ends, partial successes, and molecules that worked beautifully in a test tube and fell apart the moment they met a living body. Years passed this way. In some labs, the search was set aside entirely, deprioritized in favor of problems that seemed more solvable. The irony, looking back on it now, is almost impossible to ignore. Somewhere, completely unconnected to any of this research, completely unaware that it was relevant to any of it, an animal had already solved the exact problem these laboratories were struggling with. Not through decades of chemistry, not through careful molecular engineering, simply through the ordinary, patient logic of evolution, applied over an unimaginable span of time, to a creature that had every reason to need a version of GLP-1 that didn't vanish in minutes. Because unlike a human eating 3 times a day, this animal might not eat again for months, and whatever mechanism it used to keep its blood sugar stable across that silence would need considerably more staying power than 2 minutes in the bloodstream. Think back, for a moment, to that tale, to the idea of an animal living not meal to meal but season to season, off reserves built during rare, enormous feasts. A body built around scarcity doesn't just need a way to store fuel. It needs a way to regulate that fuel's release, carefully, gradually, over weeks rather than hours. A signal that vanished in 2 minutes would be almost useless to an animal operating on that timescale. If a creature like this had a version of GLP-1 at all, evolutionary logic alone suggests it would need to be a version built to last considerably longer than the human original. Not out of any concern for human medicine, obviously, but simply because its own survival demanded it. Nobody studying human GLP-1 in the 1980s was thinking about a Gila monster. There was no reason to. The two lines of inquiry, one in air-conditioned laboratories chasing a diabetes cure, the other in the dust and heat of the Sonoran Desert, chasing nothing at all except a creature's ordinary survival, had no obvious connection whatsoever. But somewhere, quietly, a hormone with the same essential shape and the same essential purpose had already been circulating in an animal's saliva for millions of years, doing precisely the job human researchers were trying, and largely failing, to reproduce artificially. It simply hadn't been degraded the way the human version was. It had, through whatever evolutionary pressure shaped it, been built to last. Nobody knew that yet. Nobody had any reason to look. The search for a longer-lasting GLP-1 continued on its own separate track, largely blind to the desert entirely. Synthetic modifications, animal studies unrelated to reptiles, the occasional promising lead that fizzled out under closer scrutiny. It was patient, frustrating, unglamorous work carried out by researchers who had no way of knowing that the answer they were looking for already existed, fully formed, inside an animal most of them would never have thought to study. That is the strange shape true discovery so often takes. Not a straight line from question to answer, but two separate stories, unfolding in complete ignorance of each other, waiting for something, chance, curiosity, one person's stubborn attention to a detail everyone else had overlooked, to finally bring them together. It rarely happens the way it's portrayed afterward, in the tidy retellings that make it into textbooks and press releases. There is no single moment where a research team gathers around a whiteboard and announces they have found the answer. More often, discovery looks like exactly what was happening in these years. Dozens of disconnected threads, pursued by people who mostly never meet, mostly never read each other's work, mostly never know their small, unglamorous observation might matter to anyone. Most of those threads lead nowhere. A very small number, against long odds, turn out to matter enormously. And there is rarely any way to tell, in the moment, which is which. It would take one endocrinologist, working in an unglamorous laboratory, far from any desert, with no obvious reason to be thinking about lizards at all, to notice the connection nobody else had thought to look for. We'll meet him next. Trade the desert for a moment, for a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of open space and heat-shimmered stone, but the quiet of a hospital corridor late in the day. Fluorescent light instead of sun, linoleum instead of sand, the low hum of machines that never quite turn off, the distant sound of a cart being wheeled somewhere down another hallway. There is no shimmer of heat here, no wide horizon, nothing that announces itself the way the desert does. Just the ordinary architecture of a place built to treat one patient after another, day after day, for as long as it takes. It is not a dramatic place. It was never built to be. This is the Bronx, in the early 1990s, specifically a Veterans Affairs Medical Center, one of hundreds scattered across the country, treating the ordinary, unglamorous medical needs of people who had served. Diabetes, thyroid disorders, the slow, grinding hormonal complications that accumulate over a lifetime and rarely make anyone's headlines. This was the daily work of an endocrinologist named John Eng. He had already spent years here by this point, treating patients, running the kind of appointments that repeat week after week with the quiet rhythm of ordinary medicine. Nothing about his position suggested he was on the verge of anything historic. He wasn't chasing a Nobel Prize. He wasn't working inside some gleaming pharmaceutical research campus with unlimited funding and a mandate to innovate. He was a clinician first, treating real patients with real, unglamorous conditions, and researching on the side, in whatever hours and however little funding a VA hospital laboratory could spare for it. Consider for a moment what that daily work actually looked like. Veterans, often older, often managing diabetes that had been quietly worsening for years by the time anyone caught it. Patients whose thyroid disorders had crept in unnoticed, whose energy and weight and mood had shifted so gradually that no single day felt like the day something changed. This was not the kind of medicine that produces dramatic recoveries or memorable headlines. It was the kind that requires showing up consistently for the same patients year after year, adjusting a dose here, ordering a test there, noticing the small signs that something needed attention before it became a crisis. It is, in its own way, some of the most demanding work in medicine, precisely because so little of it is ever celebrated. That detail matters more than it might seem to at first. So much of how we're taught to imagine scientific discovery involves urgency, a well-funded team, a clear deadline, a race against a rival lab. Almost none of that was true here. What was true was something quieter and in its own way more interesting. One person doing the kind of patient, curiosity-driven work that doesn't answer to anyone's quarterly targets, because there weren't any quarterly targets to answer to. It is easy to underestimate places like this. A VA hospital laboratory does not carry the prestige of a major university research center or a pharmaceutical company's private campus. It does not come with the same expectations, the same funding, the same institutional pressure to produce marketable results on a schedule. And yet, institutions exactly like this one have quietly shaped modern medicine again and again, precisely because the people working inside them are often driven by something other than commercial urgency. Clinicians who simply can't stop turning over a question they've watched play out again and again in the patients sitting across from them. That kind of motivation doesn't show up on any grant application. It shows up occasionally in results nobody was expecting. Years earlier, Eng had come across something that most people in his position would have read once, filed away, and forgotten. A set of observations made by researchers at the National Institutes of Health involving venom, not from Gila monsters specifically, at least not at first, but from a range of snakes and lizards being studied for entirely different reasons. Venom research, in general, had long attracted a particular kind of scientific curiosity. Venoms are, in a sense, nature's own pharmacology laboratories, cocktails of highly specific, highly potent molecules, refined over millions of years to act on very particular biological targets, often with extraordinary precision. Researchers had already learned by this point that studying venom could reveal compounds acting on the nervous system, the cardiovascular system, and, in some cases, unexpectedly, the digestive and metabolic system as well. One of those researchers, a gastroenterologist named Jean-Pierre Hoffman, had noticed something unusual while studying Gila monster venom in particular. Certain components of it seemed to stimulate activity in pancreatic tissue in ways that didn't fit cleanly into the existing understanding of what venom was supposed to do to a body. It was a small, technical observation, not the kind of finding that changes anyone's life on its own, but it stayed with Eng in a way that most small observations don't. He kept returning in his own thinking to a detail that had nothing directly to do with venom toxicity at all. The Gila monster's extraordinary feeding pattern. An animal that might eat only a handful of times each year, and yet, across the long stretches of nothing in between, somehow never lost control of its own blood sugar. No spikes, no dangerous crashes, just a steady, stable internal chemistry, sustained through months. Most animals could never survive without eating at all. For an endocrinologist, someone who spent his working days managing exactly that kind of stability in human patients, often imperfectly, often with considerable difficulty, that detail was not a footnote, it was the whole story, wearing a disguise. How was this animal doing something his own patients, with every tool modern medicine could offer them, still struggled to do reliably? It is worth pausing here because this is the actual shape of the discovery that would eventually reach into a refrigerator in someone's kitchen, decades later, thousands of miles from the Bronx. Not a mandate handed down from above. Not a targeted search for a diabetes blockbuster. Just one clinician sitting with an unanswered question that had quietly followed him for years, deciding, with no guarantee it would lead anywhere at all, to actually go looking for the answer. This kind of work has a name among researchers who study natural compounds for possible medical use: bioprospecting. Searching biology itself, venoms, plant compounds, obscure organisms nobody had thought to examine closely, for molecules that might already be doing, somewhere in nature, something medicine still hadn't figured out how to do artificially. It is a stranger, older idea than it might first sound. Long before modern chemistry existed, healers and physicians were, in effect, doing a rougher version of the same thing. Noticing that a particular plant seemed to ease pain or slow bleeding or calm a fever, without any understanding of why. Much of modern medicine's foundation was built this way, by observing something nature had already produced and asking patiently what was actually happening inside it. Bioprospecting is that same instinct, refined by modern chemistry. Not guessing at what a substance might do, but isolating it precisely enough to know for certain. It is unglamorous, unpredictable work. Most bioprospecting leads nowhere. The overwhelming majority of compounds examined this way turn out to be biologically uninteresting, or duplicate something already well understood, or simply don't translate into anything usable. It is the kind of research that requires a particular temperament, patience, curiosity that doesn't need constant reward, a willingness to spend real time on something that will very probably amount to nothing. Eng had that temperament, and he had a hunch worth testing. Actually obtaining Gila monster venom was, in its own quiet way, its own small undertaking. This was not a substance sitting on a laboratory supply shelf, ready to order. It meant working with sources who could provide it safely and legally. Venom collected, carefully and rarely, from an animal that was, by this point, a legally protected species across much of its range. Protected since the middle of the 20th century, back when the reasons for protecting it had nothing to do with medicine at all. Every sample mattered. There was no casual abundance here, no room for careless experimentation. Whatever answers might exist inside that venom would have to be extracted from a limited, precious supply, handled with the kind of care usually reserved for materials that cannot simply be replaced by placing another order. There is something almost poetic in that constraint, if you allow yourself to notice it. The animal that had, unknowingly, spent millions of years perfecting a molecule medicine badly needed, was also, by virtue of that same slow, patient existence, difficult to study at any scale. Nature doesn't make its more interesting answers easy to access. It hides them behind rarity, behind protection, behind the sheer inconvenience of an animal that spends 95% of its life underground and produces its most interesting substance in vanishingly small quantities. Whoever wanted to understand this venom would have to work at the animal's pace, not their own. Picture the actual bench work involved, because it is a far cry from anything resembling a dramatic laboratory reveal. Fractionating venom means separating it into its individual chemical components. Dozens of distinct molecules tangled together in the raw substance, each one needing to be isolated and examined on its own before anyone could say anything meaningful about what any single piece of it actually did. It involves chromatography columns, painstaking measurement, hours spent watching separations that might, in the end, reveal nothing at all. Each fraction, once separated, would need to be tested in its own assay, exposed to pancreatic tissue or cells in culture, then measured for any response at all, most of the time finding none. It is quiet work. It is repetitive work. On most days, it produces nothing worth mentioning to anyone. There is no dramatic soundtrack to this kind of afternoon. No swelling music as a result comes back. Just a technician or a researcher working largely alone, recording numbers into a notebook, comparing them against what came before, and moving on to the next fraction in the sequence. Because the only way through work like this is directly through it, one unremarkable measurement at a time. There would have been false starts. There always are in work like this. Components isolated and tested that turned out to be biologically unremarkable. Fractions that looked promising under one condition and meant nothing under another. Weeks that ended exactly where they began. None of that made it into any eventual account of the discovery, because none of it was the discovery. It was simply what discovery is actually made of, most of the time, long stretches of nothing, punctuated, if you are fortunate and patient enough, by one moment that changes everything. It is worth imagining, honestly, what sustains someone through that kind of ratio, through weeks and months, where the overwhelming likelihood at every single step is that nothing of consequence will be found. It is not the promise of fame. Almost nobody doing this kind of work expects fame. It is closer to something quieter and more stubborn, a genuine private need to know the answer to a question, regardless of whether anyone else is watching, regardless of whether the answer ever proves useful to anyone at all. That kind of curiosity doesn't require an audience. It only requires the question to matter enough to one person to keep going. There is something worth lingering on here, a kind of quiet dignity in it. We tend to imagine scientific breakthroughs arriving in a flash. A single dramatic instant, the lights coming up, the eureka moment captured cleanly for the history books. Almost none of them actually happen that way. They happen the way this one did. An ordinary Tuesday in an ordinary lab, inside an ordinary VA hospital that most of the country had never heard of, with a researcher patiently working through material that might, for all he knew at the time, have nothing to teach him at all. No press was watching. No funding body was waiting on quarterly results. No headline was forming anywhere. Just a peptide, sitting in a fraction of venom, not yet named, not yet understood. And one person, methodically, patiently, moving closer to it without knowing that's what he was doing. If you find yourself picturing the desert again here, the stillness of it, the heat held in the rocks long after the sun goes down, the sense of something ancient, simply waiting to be noticed, that instinct isn't wrong. In a very real sense, that desert had already traveled here, carried inside a small vial in a laboratory freezer, thousands of miles from where a Gila monster last moved slowly between two stones. The distance between the two settings was enormous. The distance between the questions being asked in each of them was not. The National Institutes of Health had funded the initial venom research years earlier, for reasons that had nothing to do with diabetes at all, a general interest in venom toxicity, in understanding what these compounds did to living tissue. That research had drifted, quietly, out of active attention, once its narrow original questions were answered. Eng's return to it was not part of any larger program. It was closer to a private hypothesis, tested on the margins of a career built around treating patients, not chasing publications. This is, in its way, the most human part of the entire story. Not a corporation, not a national laboratory with unlimited resources. One clinician treating diabetic patients by day, unable to stop thinking about a lizard that seemed to have already solved a problem he watched people struggle with, medically, every single week. By the time he ran the assay that would matter, the one that would finally, after all the fractions that led nowhere, isolate something worth naming, there was nothing outwardly different about that particular day. No sense of occasion. No reason to expect this attempt to succeed where so many earlier ones hadn't. It was simply the next step in a long patient sequence, run the way all the others had been run, carefully, methodically, without any guarantee it would produce anything at all. Somewhere in a hospital laboratory in the Bronx, on an unremarkable afternoon that no calendar would ever mark, that was where things stood. A researcher, a sample, a long patient sequence of measurements that had, so far, told him nothing he didn't already expect. He prepared the sample. He ran the assay. And somewhere in the resulting data, in a signal that didn't behave the way the earlier uninteresting fractions had behaved, something was different. He wouldn't know yet exactly what he was looking at, not fully, not the structure, not the name, not the decades of medicine it would eventually help build. All he had in that moment was a result that didn't match his expectations. A small, precise anomaly, sitting quietly in the data, waiting for someone patient enough to take it seriously, instead of dismissing it as noise. Most anomalies are noise. That is the honest, unglamorous truth of laboratory work. The overwhelming majority of unexpected results, when followed up on, turn out to be errors, contamination, or simple statistical chance. It would have been entirely reasonable, entirely forgivable, to note the anomaly, run the assay again to check for an obvious mistake, and move on if nothing further presented itself. Most researchers, most of the time, do exactly that, because most of the time, that is the correct call. This time, it wasn't noise. It held up. Run again, it held up again. Examined more closely, it didn't dissolve into an explanation involving contamination or error. Something real was sitting inside that fraction of venom. Something distinct, something that behaved the way no ordinary component of venom should behave. Not toxic in any conventional sense, not damaging. Something that, the more closely it was examined, looked less like a weapon and more like a message. Not fully understood yet, not named yet, but real. That is where we'll pick up next. Confirmation in a laboratory rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in stages, each one a little more convincing than the last, each one closing off one more possible explanation for why a result might be wrong. First, the assay was repeated, not once but several times, with fresh preparations, under conditions designed specifically to rule out the most obvious culprits: contamination, degraded samples, a simple error in measurement. Each time, the same unusual activity appeared. Each time, it survived the kind of scrutiny that dissolves most false leads within a single afternoon. There is a particular discipline required here that has nothing to do with excitement and everything to do with restraint. The temptation, the moment a result looks interesting, is to believe it immediately, to let hope get ahead of the evidence. Good laboratory practice runs in the opposite direction entirely. It assumes, by default, that an unexpected result is more likely to be a mistake than a discovery, and it keeps testing that assumption again and again until the evidence itself becomes too consistent to explain away. Only then does cautious belief become permissible. Then came the slower, more exacting work, actually isolating the substance responsible. Not just noticing that something in the venom produced an effect, but separating that something from everything else in the sample, purifying it fraction by fraction, narrowing an entire complex venom down to a single, specific molecule that could be examined entirely on its own terms. This is where laboratory work stops being detective work and starts being something closer to sculpture. You don't find the answer sitting whole on a table. You carve everything else away from around it, patiently, one pass at a time, until what remains is small enough, pure enough, to actually look at clearly. What emerged by 1992 was a peptide, a short chain of amino acids, 39 of them, linked together in a specific, unrepeating sequence, distinct from anything previously catalogued in Gila monster venom, or for that matter, anywhere else. Small as biological molecules go, precise, and as the data continued to accumulate, unmistakably active in exactly the way the earlier anomaly had suggested. It needed a name. Eng called it Exendin 4, the fourth in a small family of related exendin peptides identified from the venom. The name itself quietly built from two words that don't usually appear together. Exocrine, referring to glands that release their contents through a duct, the way saliva glands do, and endocrine, referring to glands that release hormones directly into the bloodstream, the way the pancreas does. A single molecule, produced by an exocrine gland, behaving like an endocrine one. The name wasn't decorative. It was a small, precise description of exactly what made this molecule strange in the first place. A hormone-like signal, manufactured in a gland built for something else entirely, doing a job nature doesn't usually ask salivary tissue to do. There is a kind of scientific honesty in a name like that. It doesn't promise anything. It doesn't hint at diabetes or medicine or any of what would come later. It simply describes, as precisely as language allows, what the molecule was and where it came from. A hybrid, in function if not in origin, quietly blurring a line biology doesn't usually blur. Naming something is a strange kind of milestone. It doesn't change the molecule itself. Exendin 4 had existed, quietly, inside every Gila monster's saliva for as long as the species itself had existed, entirely indifferent to whether anyone in a laboratory ever got around to giving it a label. And yet the name mattered enormously to the humans involved, because it marked the moment a stray anomaly in a data set became, officially, a real and specific thing. Something that could be discussed, compared, tested against other known molecules, built into a body of evidence rather than dismissed as an unexplained blip. The next question was the obvious one. What did this molecule actually resemble? Here is where the story reaches back, deliberately, directly, to something we spent an entire section examining earlier. Human GLP-1, the fragile hormone, the message written in sand, gone within minutes of arriving. When Eng compared the structure of Exendin 4 against it, the resemblance was immediate and impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Roughly half of the amino acid sequence matched. Not identical. These were, after all, molecules from entirely different species, shaped by entirely different evolutionary pressures, but similar enough, in exactly the right places, that Exendin 4 could bind to the same receptor human GLP-1 binds to and trigger, essentially, the same set of downstream effects. Insulin release, tuned to elevated blood sugar, suppressed glucagon, slowed digestion, the same quiet influence on appetite that GLP-1 exerts in a human body. Picture for a moment two keys cut for the same lock, not identical keys filed by different hands, from different blanks entirely, and yet close enough in shape that either one turns the mechanism just the same. That is roughly what Eng was looking at. A molecule built by an entirely separate evolutionary lineage, arriving through means that had nothing to do with human biology at all, at something close enough to human GLP-1 to unlock the exact same door. It is worth pausing on how strange that actually is, biologically speaking. Humans and Gila monsters share a common ancestor, so distant in time that it predates almost everything recognizable about either species today. Hundreds of millions of years of separate evolution, separate pressures, separate solutions to separate problems, and yet along two completely independent paths. Something remarkably similar emerged in both lineages. A short peptide capable of binding the same receptor, triggering the same cascade, solving in its own context a comparable problem of energy regulation. This is not the kind of thing that happens because two systems copied each other. It happens because a particular chemical solution is apparently a genuinely good one. Good enough that evolution arrived at close variations of it more than once, in creatures that never had any contact with one another at all. That alone would have been a notable finding. Structural similarity between a reptile venom peptide and a human hormone is the kind of thing that earns a paper, a handful of citations, a modest place in the specialized literature. It would not, on its own, have explained why this particular discovery would eventually matter to millions of people who had never heard of a Gila monster. The second finding did that. Remember the fragility we spent so long examining. That devastating half-life, GLP-1 dismantled by the enzyme DPP-4 within a minute or two of release, gone before its full effect could ever be sustained. Remember the frustration researchers everywhere had run into, again and again, trying to engineer around that fragility without breaking the molecule's function in the process. Exendin 4 did not share that weakness. There was a small but crucial difference in its structure. A single position near the beginning of the amino acid chain, subtly altered compared to the human original. That made it far more resistant to exactly the kind of enzymatic degradation that destroyed GLP-1 so quickly. Where human GLP-1 lasted a minute or two in circulation, Exendin 4 lasted dramatically longer. Hours, not minutes. The same basic message, the same lock, the same key. But this time, the message didn't wash away with the tide. It stayed. A single position in a chain of 39. That is all the difference amounted to, structurally speaking. One small alteration in one specific spot, invisible to anything but the most careful molecular comparison. And yet, that single alteration was enough to change everything about how useful the molecule could be. It is a reminder of how little separates a hormone that works beautifully for 2 minutes from one that works beautifully for hours. Not a wholesale redesign, but one precise, almost surgical difference, sitting exactly where it needed to sit. This is worth sitting with, because it is the actual center of the entire discovery, not the existence of a GLP-1-like molecule in nature, which was interesting but not unprecedented, but the existence of one that had already solved, through nothing but the ordinary machinery of evolution, the single problem that had stopped human researchers cold for years. Nobody had engineered this. Nobody had sat down with a whiteboard and designed a longer-lasting GLP-1 analog from scratch. A desert animal needing to regulate its blood sugar across months of fasting rather than hours between meals had simply needed a version of this signal that could last considerably longer than the human one, and evolution, working patiently over an almost incomprehensible span of time, had already built exactly that. The lizard hadn't been trying to cure diabetes. It had only ever been trying to survive its own metabolism. But the solution to one problem turned out to be, essentially, the solution to the other as well. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a discovery like this. Not loud excitement, not popping champagne, but something closer to disbelief, settling slowly into certainty. Every additional test that came back consistent with the pattern made the conclusion a little harder to doubt. A molecule this similar to human GLP-1, a molecule this resistant to exactly the degradation that made GLP-1 pharmacologically useless, found in Venom. From a lizard, nobody had thought to look at this closely before. Consider too the sheer improbability of the timing. This wasn't a molecule anyone had set out to design with these exact properties in mind. It was simply already there, waiting, whether or not anyone in the 1980s or 1990s ever got around to looking closely enough to notice. If Eng had not returned, years later, to a small NIH observation most researchers had long since forgotten. If he had not happened to be the kind of clinician who kept turning a stubborn question over in his mind year after year, without any external pressure demanding he do so. If any one of those quiet, unremarkable choices had gone differently, this molecule might have sat undiscovered for decades longer, or never been noticed at all, recognized, understood, real. What happens next in most versions of this story, the version told in retrospect, cleaned up and simplified, is a triumphant leap straight into drug development. A discovery this significant, surely, would have been seized upon immediately, funded generously, rushed toward patients as quickly as possible. That is not what happened. Eng, recognizing the potential significance of what he'd found, took the discovery to the administrators at the VA, the institution that had funded his research. Typically, in cases like this, a research institution has a formal process, an office responsible for evaluating whether a discovery has commercial potential, and if so, for handling the complicated, expensive work of securing a patent and finding a partner willing to develop it further. The VA declined, not out of any dismissal of the science itself, but for a narrower, more bureaucratic reason. The discovery, as significant as it might prove to be for the general public, didn't address a condition specific to military veterans. No direct connection to combat injury, no clear tie to the particular medical needs the VA's research mission was built around. Diabetes, of course, affects veterans as much as anyone else, but the institutional logic that governs how such decisions get made doesn't always track general medical importance. It tracks mandate. And on paper, this discovery fell outside it. Institutions, even well-intentioned ones, are built around rules. Rules that exist for perfectly sound reasons most of the time, and that occasionally, without any malice involved, fail to account for the exception sitting directly in front of them. The VA's mission was, reasonably, focused on veteran-specific medical needs. A general population diabetes therapy, however promising, simply didn't fit the shape of what that mission was designed to fund and protect. Nobody involved in that decision was wrong exactly by the rules they were working from. The rules themselves simply weren't built to recognize a discovery this unusual. There is something almost quietly absurd about that moment, in hindsight. An institution looking at what would eventually become one of the most consequential pharmaceutical discoveries of the modern era, and concluding, reasonably, according to its own internal rules, that it simply wasn't the VA's place to pursue it. So Eng did something else. He pursued the patent himself. This was not a small undertaking for an individual researcher, particularly one whose primary role remained clinical. Treating patients, running a hospital practice, doing research on the margins of a full-time medical career. Patenting a discovery involves legal costs, careful documentation, months or years of process, all of it separate from the actual science that had already consumed years of unfunded effort. There is no institutional machinery quietly doing this work in the background for an individual the way there is for a well-resourced research center. Every step, finding the right legal counsel, drafting claims precise enough to hold up to scrutiny, navigating a process designed more with corporations and universities in mind than with a single clinician acting largely on his own, had to be handled directly on top of an already full professional life. It would have been entirely understandable at this point for the discovery to simply stall, recognized, documented, published in the scientific literature, and then left there. Another interesting finding that never made it any further, because no institution stood ready to carry it forward. That is, in fact, what happens to the overwhelming majority of interesting scientific findings. Most good ideas in medicine die not from being wrong, but from lack of anyone with the resources, timing, or institutional backing to carry them the considerable distance from laboratory curiosity to actual medicine. Exendin 4, for a while, sat in exactly that kind of limbo. Patented, but not developed. Understood, but not yet useful to a single patient. A molecule that had already solved, in principle, a problem an entire field of researchers had been chasing. Sitting quietly, waiting for someone with the resources to take the next step. Consider what that limbo actually looked like, in practical terms. A patent is not a product. It is not a treatment. It is, at its core, a legal document establishing ownership of an idea, a claim staked on a molecule structure and function, protecting the right to develop it commercially, but conferring none of the resources actually required to do so. Turning Exendin 4 into an approved medicine would require synthesizing it reliably at scale, testing it rigorously in animals and then in human volunteers, running large and expensive clinical trials, and navigating years of regulatory review. An enterprise that costs, typically, hundreds of millions of dollars and the sustained effort of large, specialized teams. None of that existed yet. There was only a patent, a peptide, and a researcher whose day job had never stopped being the care of his patients. The gap between a promising discovery and an approved medicine is, in almost every case, far wider than the discovery itself. This is the part of scientific history that rarely gets told in the same detail as the eureka moment, because it lacks the drama. Years spent simply searching for someone, anyone, with the resources and the willingness to take on the considerable risk of trying to build something real out of a patent and a peptide. Think back, if you can, to that image from the very beginning of this story. A drug sitting quietly in a refrigerator in someone's home, waiting at the end of a very long path. This is the moment furthest from that image the story will ever reach. No refrigerator, no pharmacy, no patient. Just a peptide, its name recorded in a patent filing, and a question with no clear answer yet. Who, if anyone, would be willing to turn this into something the world could actually use? That is where we'll pick up next. Every discovery that eventually reaches a patient passes, at some point, through a moment that has nothing to do with science at all. A moment where someone with money and a willingness to risk it decides that a patent sitting quietly in a filing cabinet is worth the enormous gamble of trying to turn it into something real. Most patents never receive that moment. They sit, technically valid, commercially untouched, until they eventually expire, unused, having protected an idea that nobody ever found the resources or the nerve to develop. The history of medicine is full of near discoveries exactly like this. Molecules identified, characterized, understood in principle, and then quietly abandoned. Not because the science was wrong, but because nobody with sufficient capital ever decided the risk was worth taking. For Exendin 4, that moment arrived through a small biotechnology company based in San Diego called Amylin Pharmaceuticals. Amylin was not at the time a household name. It was a modest company by pharmaceutical industry standards, already working in a related space: the biology of diabetes, the hormones and signals that govern blood sugar. The kind of research territory where a molecule like Exendin 4 would have registered immediately as significant to anyone paying close attention. When word of Eng's discovery reached people at Amylin, the underlying logic would have been almost self-evident to anyone in that field. A naturally occurring molecule, structurally similar to human GLP-1, dramatically more resistant to the degradation that made GLP-1 useless as a drug. That is not a subtle finding to someone whose entire career is spent thinking about exactly this class of problem. It is closer to finding the one piece of a puzzle everyone else had been sanding down by hand, already cut to the correct shape. Amylin licensed the discovery. Licensing in this context is a fairly specific arrangement. Amylin gained the rights to develop and commercialize Exendin 4 as a medicine, while the underlying discovery and its intellectual property remained tied back to Eng's original patent. It was the first real institutional home this molecule had found since it left the laboratory in the Bronx. But a license alone does not make a medicine. It only makes the attempt possible. Turning Exendin 4 into an actual pharmaceutical product required, first, a synthetic version, a manufactured, laboratory-produced form of the peptide, identical in structure to what occurs naturally in Gila monster venom, but produced at a scale and purity no venom collection process could ever realistically achieve. This synthetic version would eventually be given its own name, separate from the molecule's original scientific label, exenatide. Same structure, same function, a different name, marking the shift from a naturally occurring curiosity to a manufactured pharmaceutical candidate. Even with the synthetic version in hand, the distance remaining between exenatide and an approved medicine was enormous. Amylin, for all its expertise, was still a relatively small company facing the extraordinarily expensive, extraordinarily risky process of large-scale clinical development. The kind of undertaking that, historically, has bankrupted companies many times Amylin's size, when a promising drug candidate failed at a late stage of testing, after years and hundreds of millions of dollars had already been spent. In 2002, Amylin partnered with Eli Lilly and Company, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, with decades of experience specifically in diabetes medicine, dating back, in one form or another, to the earliest days of commercial insulin production. The partnership gave exenatide something it had never had before: the resources, regulatory expertise, and sheer institutional scale required to move a promising molecule through the full, punishing gauntlet of human clinical trials. There is a reason partnerships like this exist throughout the pharmaceutical industry, and it has little to do with any single company being unable to innovate on its own. Bringing a new drug from a licensed discovery to an approved medicine typically costs several $100 million, sometimes considerably more, spread across years of manufacturing development, toxicology studies, and clinical trials involving thousands of participants across dozens of sites. A company the size Amylin was at the time could plausibly have managed the earlier, smaller stages of this work alone. The later stages, the large, expensive, statistically rigorous trials the FDA requires before approving any new medicine, demanded resources on a different scale entirely. Lilly could provide that scale. Amylin brought the underlying science. Neither company, most likely, would have reached approval on its own within a comparable time frame. This is worth pausing on because it says something true about how modern medicine actually gets made. The discovery, the genuinely novel, curiosity-driven insight, had come from one clinician, working largely alone in an under-resourced hospital laboratory. The development, the years of manufacturing, testing, regulatory navigation, and enormous financial risk required an entirely different kind of institution altogether. Neither piece on its own would have been enough. It took both, the individual patience of discovery and the industrial patience of development, working in sequence years apart to carry one molecule the full distance from a lizard's mouth to a pharmacy shelf. The clinical trial process that followed unfolded across years, not months. Early trials involving smaller numbers of participants tested basic questions of safety and dosing, how the drug behaved in the human body, what side effects appeared, what an appropriate dose actually looked like. Only after those questions were answered carefully enough did the program advance to the large-scale trials that would ultimately determine whether exenatide actually worked well enough and safely enough to become a real medicine. The clinical trial process that followed unfolded across years, not months. Early trials involving smaller numbers of participants tested basic questions of safety and dosing, how the drug behaved in the human body, what side effects appeared, what an appropriate dose actually looked like. Only after those questions were answered carefully enough did the program advance to the large-scale trials that would ultimately determine whether exenatide actually worked well enough and safely enough to become a real medicine. Each phase built on the one before it, deliberately and cautiously. A handful of participants first watched closely, every reaction documented. Then a somewhat larger group, testing whether early promise held up across more varied patients, more varied circumstances. Only at the final stage did the trials expand to the numbers required to say something statistically meaningful about how exenatide compared to existing treatments and to existing placebo across a population large enough to reveal patterns that a smaller study simply couldn't detect. This is deliberately slow by design. A therapy destined for potentially millions of patients cannot be approved on the strength of a promising handful of early cases. It has to earn its way through evidence at every single stage before it's allowed anywhere near a pharmacy shelf. Picture, for a moment, what those later trials would have looked like from the inside. Not as an abstract statistic, but as an actual sequence of appointments for actual patients living with type 2 diabetes that oral medications alone hadn't been enough to control. Blood drawn, glucose measured. The careful, unglamorous rhythm of a clinical trial, repeated across months, across multiple trial sites, across thousands of individual data points, slowly accumulating into something researchers could finally analyze with confidence. And what that accumulating data eventually showed was, in its own understated way, remarkable. Patients receiving exenatide saw meaningful improvements in blood sugar control. Both the everyday fluctuations after meals and the longer-term marker doctors used to track diabetes management over months at a time. It was working in human patients, largely the way the underlying biology had suggested it should. Remember, from earlier in this story, the fragile hormone we spent so long examining, GLP-1, dismantled within a minute or two of release. A message written in sand, gone before the tide had even finished coming in. That fragility was the entire reason this whole search had begun in the first place. Now, in trial after trial, patients were receiving injections of a molecule that solved exactly that problem. Not human GLP-1 itself, too short-lived to ever function as a practical medicine, but its longer-lasting cousin, borrowed from a desert lizard's saliva, doing the same essential job without disappearing within minutes. The message that once vanished with the tide was, for the first time, actually staying long enough to matter. It is strange, and worth sitting with, that the answer to a distinctly human problem, a fragile hormone, a body that couldn't sustain its own best signal long enough to use it, had never required inventing anything genuinely new at all. It only required someone patient enough to notice that nature, somewhere else entirely, had already built a sturdier version, for reasons that had nothing to do with human medicine and everything to do with one animal's ordinary need to survive its own extraordinary fasts. There is something worth feeling in that moment beyond the clinical data itself. Somewhere in these trials, actual patients, people who had spent years managing a difficult, chronic condition, adjusting doses, monitoring numbers, living with the slow accumulation of a disease that rarely announces its damage clearly, were, for the first time, benefiting from a solution that had started, however improbably, inside the mouth of an animal most of them would never have wanted anywhere near them. By July of 2004, Amelin and Lily had accumulated enough evidence from their trial program to formally submit an application to the United States Food and Drug Administration, seeking approval to market exenatide as a treatment for type 2 diabetes. What followed was the kind of review process that moves at an institution's pace rather than a discovery's. Careful, methodical, unglamorous in its own way, checking and rechecking the evidence before allowing a new medicine anywhere near the general public. On April 29, 2005, the FDA approved it. The drug would be sold under the brand name Byetta, a name chosen for pronunciation and memorability. Nothing scientific about it. The kind of decision made in a marketing meeting rather than a laboratory. It became available to pharmacies a little over a month later, in June of that year. And with that approval, Byetta became something genuinely new in the history of medicine. The first drug ever approved in an entirely new pharmaceutical class, one that would eventually be called incretin mimetics. Medicines that work by imitating the body's own incretin hormones, rather than simply overriding the body's signaling with external insulin the way older diabetes treatments had always done. Consider what that approval actually represented beyond its immediate clinical value. For decades, the dominant approach to treating diabetes when oral medications weren't enough had been essentially the same: supply the body with more insulin from the outside, compensating for what the body could no longer manage on its own. Byetta represented something categorically different, not replacing the body's own regulatory system, but restoring a version of it, coaxing the body's own insulin response back towards something closer to its natural, glucose-dependent rhythm. It was less a matter of overriding the body, and more a matter of reminding it how to do something it had, in a sense, forgotten how to do reliably on its own. 13 years. That is roughly the distance between an anomalous result in a Bronx laboratory and a drug finally reaching an actual patient's medicine cabinet. 13 years of isolation, characterization, patent filings, licensing negotiations, synthesis, trials, and regulatory review. An entire chain of separate, difficult steps, any one of which could plausibly have failed, any one of which had historically failed for countless other promising discoveries that never made it this far. It is worth naming, plainly, everything that had to go right along that 13-year path. A clinician had to notice a small forgotten observation and refuse to let it go. A discovery had to survive an institution's decision not to pursue it. A patent had to be secured on an individual's own initiative against real financial and professional risk. A small company had to recognize the discovery's significance and take a chance on licensing it. That small company had to find a much larger partner willing to shoulder the enormous cost of full clinical development. And an entire trial program spanning years and thousands of patients had to actually demonstrate rigorously that the drug worked and was safe enough to approve. Remove any single link in that chain, and this entire story simply doesn't reach a pharmacy. It stays a footnote, a curious peptide, isolated once in a paper very few people ever read. It did not fail. A molecule discovered in the saliva of a desert lizard was now, quietly, becoming part of ordinary medical practice, prescribed by doctors, injected by patients, doing precisely the job its natural origin had always done for the animal that made it. Only now inside human bodies it had never evolved to serve. Byetta was not, however, a perfect solution, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. Its resistance to degradation, while dramatically better than human GLP-1's own fragile minute or two, still fell well short of ideal for everyday use. Patients using it needed to inject it twice a day before their two largest meals, a real ongoing burden for anyone managing a chronic condition across years or decades of their life. And because Ozempic, for all its similarity to human GLP-1, remained a molecule the human immune system recognized as foreign, built, after all, from a different species' biochemistry, a meaningful proportion of patients developed antibodies against it over time. For most, this caused no serious clinical problem. For some, it complicated or limited how well the drug continued to work. The lizard had given medicine an extraordinary gift, proof that a longer-lasting version of GLP-1 could exist and could work safely and effectively in a human body. But the lizard's own version of the solution, built for its own specific biology across its own evolutionary timeline, was not necessarily the final answer for a species that hadn't evolved alongside it. Twice daily injections, immune responses in some patients, a molecule that had solved the fragility problem, but not completely, and not without leaving new problems of its own in its place. For a patient, twice daily dosing before meals is not an abstract inconvenience. It is a real, recurring demand on daily life. Remembering the injection, timing it correctly around food, carrying supplies, managing the small but persistent friction of a medical routine woven into the most ordinary parts of a day. Many patients found the burden entirely worthwhile, given the improvement in their blood sugar control. Others found it difficult to sustain over the long term, exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous obstacle that determines whether a genuinely effective medicine actually gets used consistently, year after year, or gradually falls away from a patient's routine. Researchers understood this almost immediately. Byetta's approval was not treated within the scientific community as a finish line. It was treated as proof of concept, evidence that the entire approach worked, evidence solid enough to justify the next, more ambitious question that had already begun quietly forming in laboratories far from the Bronx, far from San Diego, in a country most of this story hasn't visited yet. If a molecule borrowed from nature could last hours instead of minutes, extending human GLP-1's brief, fragile message into something genuinely useful, what would it take to build something that lasted even longer? Not hours, but days. Not twice daily injections that patients would need to remember without fail for the rest of their lives, but something closer to once a week. Something engineered this time, not discovered by accident in a lizard's mouth, but designed deliberately, molecule by molecule, by chemists who now understood, thanks to Exendin 4, exactly what they were chasing. That pursuit would take years. It would take an entirely different research effort, on an entirely different continent, building on a foundation the desert had unknowingly provided. That is where we'll go next. Somewhere north of the deserts and hospital corridors, this story has moved through so far. On a different continent entirely, a different kind of pursuit had already been quietly underway for years. One that had nothing to do with lizards at all. In Denmark, a pharmaceutical company called Novo Nordisk had spent decades as one of the world's most established names in diabetes care, its roots reaching back to the earliest era of commercial insulin production, back when insulin itself was still a relatively new and precious therapy, extracted painstakingly from animal sources before modern biotechnology made purer, more reliable production possible. By the time this part of the story begins, diabetes wasn't a peripheral interest for this company. It was, in a real sense, the entire reason it existed. There is a particular kind of institutional memory that builds up inside a company that has spent close to a century focused on a single disease. Generations of researchers coming and going, each one inheriting not just data, but a kind of accumulated intuition about where a disease like diabetes actually causes suffering, and where the field's existing tools still fell short. By the later decades of the 20th century, that inherited intuition pointed again and again toward the same unresolved frustration researchers everywhere kept running into: the body's own best regulatory signal, GLP-1, disappearing before it could ever be harnessed properly. And Novo Nordisk's researchers had been watching the same unfolding story we've been following: the incretin research, the promise and the frustration of GLP-1's fragility, the arrival of Exenatide as proof that a longer-lasting version was possible. But they were pursuing that same underlying goal from a different direction entirely. To understand that direction, it helps to go back, briefly, one more time, to the human hormone itself, and to a scientist whose name rarely appears in the popular retellings of this story, despite how foundational her work actually was. Decades before any of the events we've discussed so far, a biochemist named Svetlana Moisov, working at Rockefeller University, spent years painstakingly determining the precise sequence of human GLP-1, establishing, at the molecular level, exactly what this hormone was built from, atom by atom, link by link along its chain of amino acids. This was slow, exacting work, the kind that rarely receives public recognition, even when it turns out to be essential. It is worth pausing on that quietly, because so much of this story has already been about people whose names rarely make it into the popular version of events. Eng, working largely alone in an under-resourced VA laboratory. Raufman, whose earlier observation about Venom and the pancreas might easily have stayed forgotten. And now Moisov, spending years on the kind of foundational chemistry that produces no dramatic headline of its own, but without which almost none of what followed would have had solid ground to stand on. Without a precise understanding of GLP-1's actual structure, none of what followed, not Exenatide's comparison to it, not any later attempt to engineer a longer-lasting version of it, would have had a clear foundation to build from. Moisov's sequencing work, completed years before anyone imagined a drug like Ozempic, became the quiet scaffolding underneath an entire future field of medicine. This is, perhaps, one of the more overlooked truths about how major medical advances actually happen. The name that eventually gets attached to a breakthrough drug is rarely the only name that mattered. Behind every molecule this story has discussed so far, Exendin 4, Exenatide, and now whatever Novo Nordisk's researchers were beginning to build, sits a long chain of earlier, quieter contributions, each one indispensable, most of them never receiving anything close to the recognition the final product eventually would. There were, in other words, two separate strategies available for solving GLP-1's fragility, and by the early years of the new millennium, researchers around the world had begun pursuing both. One strategy, the one this story has followed so far, borrowed a solution nature had already built in a completely different species, for a completely different reason. Exendin 4, discovered by accident in a lizard's venom, offered a working answer without requiring anyone to engineer one from scratch. The other strategy went in the opposite direction entirely. Rather than borrowing an already stable molecule from elsewhere in nature, it asked a more deliberate, more painstaking question. Could you take the actual human hormone, GLP-1 itself, in its own native form, and modify it directly, precisely enough to fix its fragility without losing what made it work in the first place? This was, in its own way, a far more difficult undertaking. Exendin 4 arrived already solved, its stability built in by millions of years of evolution, waiting only to be noticed. Engineering stability directly into the human molecule meant starting from something inherently fragile and trying to redesign it, piece by piece, without breaking the very properties that made it valuable to begin with. It meant chemistry, not discovery. Deliberate design, not fortunate observation. There is a meaningful distinction worth sitting with here, between finding an answer and building one. The desert had offered its answer freely, in a sense, fully formed, requiring only that someone patient enough come looking for it. This second path offered nothing freely. Every gain in stability had to be earned, through trial and failure, through molecules synthesized and tested and discarded when they didn't behave as hoped, through years of a kind of careful engineering that has no shortcut, no lucky discovery waiting to skip the work. Both paths, in the end, arrived somewhere useful. But they arrived by entirely different means, at entirely different speeds, requiring entirely different kinds of patience from the people pursuing them. Here is where the researchers pursuing this path arrived at an idea worth sitting with for a moment, because it is genuinely clever in a quiet, unglamorous way. Blood contains a great deal of protein, most abundantly a molecule called albumin, which circulates constantly in enormous quantities, performing all sorts of unglamorous transport work throughout the body. Albumin is not fragile. It doesn't vanish within minutes the way GLP-1 does. It persists in the bloodstream for days, sometimes longer, simply going about its business, largely undisturbed by the enzymes that make quick work of smaller, more vulnerable molecules like GLP-1. What if, researchers began to ask, you didn't need to redesign GLP-1's fragile core at all? What if you simply gave it something to hold on to, attached it deliberately to something the body already treated as durable, letting the fragile hormone effectively hitch a ride on something sturdier than itself? Picture a small, easily lost object, a single key, say, attached to a heavy, unmissable keychain. On its own, that key could slip through a pocket seam and disappear without anyone noticing for days. Attached to something bulkier, something the owner keeps careful track of, it becomes almost impossible to lose. The key hasn't changed. It's exactly as small and exactly as easy to misplace as it always was. But now, it travels attached to something the world simply doesn't let go of carelessly. There is a quiet elegance to this approach that's worth appreciating on its own terms. It does not try to outsmart the enzyme responsible for GLP-1's fragility through direct confrontation, redesigning the molecule so thoroughly that the enzyme simply can't recognize it anymore, the way Exendin 4's natural structure managed. Instead, it works around the problem entirely, hiding the vulnerable hormone inside the folds of something the enzyme system has no interest in touching. It is less a redesign than a disguise. The same fragile message, still exactly as fragile as it always was on its own, simply no longer traveling alone and exposed. That, in essence, was the strategy. Researchers attached a small fatty acid chain to the GLP-1 molecule at a carefully chosen position along its structure, alongside one additional small modification elsewhere in the sequence for extra stability. That fatty acid tail gave the modified hormone something it never had on its own: the ability to bind, reversibly, to albumin, circulating in the bloodstream. Once attached, the GLP-1 analog was no longer traveling alone, exposed and vulnerable to the enzymes waiting to break it apart within minutes. It was, in effect, riding along with albumin, shielded, carried, released slowly and steadily, back into active circulation over a period of hours rather than minutes. The resulting molecule kept the vast majority of its structure identical to natural human GLP-1, well over 90% of the original sequence unchanged. It was not a foreign molecule borrowed from another species. It was, in the most meaningful sense, still recognizably human GLP-1, wearing one small, carefully engineered addition that transformed its practical usefulness entirely. There is something worth noticing in the contrast between this approach and the one that produced exenatide. Exendin 4 arrived as a gift, already whole, requiring nothing but recognition. This molecule arrived as an act of construction, deliberate, incremental, built one careful modification at a time by chemists who had to imagine, then test, then refine an idea that didn't yet exist anywhere in nature. Two entirely different paths, born from entirely different circumstances, converging on the same underlying goal: give this fragile, essential hormone enough time in the bloodstream to actually do its work. The effect on its half-life was dramatic. Where native human GLP-1 survived in the bloodstream for a minute or two before being dismantled, this modified version persisted for something closer to half a day. Long enough, for the first time, to support a single daily injection, rather than the multiple daily doses earlier approaches had required. This molecule would eventually be named Liraglutide, and it would reach patients under the brand name Victoza. Getting there, as always in this story, took years. Novo Nordisk's work on this fatty acid approach to extending GLP-1 stability began in earnest in the mid-1990s, years of chemistry and animal testing before the modified molecule was ever given to a single human volunteer. Early phase human trials began around the turn of the millennium, testing safety and dosing the same careful, incremental way exenatide's trials had years earlier. Then came the larger studies, an extensive Phase 3 program spanning several years and thousands of participants across multiple trials, examining how well the drug controlled blood sugar compared to existing treatments in patients using it alone and in combination with other diabetes medications they were already taking. Picture the span of a career unfolding across this timeline. A chemist beginning work on this fatty acid strategy in the mid-1990s, refining it through years of laboratory testing, would have been well into a different phase of their career entirely by the time the finished medicine finally reached a pharmacy shelf more than a decade later. This is not the kind of work that offers quick validation. It asks for a particular kind of professional patience, the willingness to spend years on a single incremental idea, trusting that the slow accumulation of careful evidence will eventually justify the time spent, without any guarantee at the outset that it actually will. The pattern, by now, may feel familiar, and that familiarity is itself worth noticing. This is not a story with one single miraculous breakthrough at its center. It is a story built from an accumulating rhythm of patient, unglamorous progress. One careful trial after another, one incremental gain in half-life after another, one small improvement in convenience after another, each one building directly on lessons the last had already taught. Exenatide proved a longer-lasting GLP-1 could work safely in humans at all. Liraglutide proved that a version built directly from the human hormone itself, rather than borrowed from another species, could achieve even greater duration without needing to rely on an animal-derived molecule the immune system might eventually recognize as foreign. There is a kind of quiet relay happening across this entire history, each discovery handing something forward to the next, without any of the individual participants necessarily knowing how the whole relay would eventually end. Moisov's sequence, Eng's peptide, Amelin and Lilly's trials. Now, Novo Nordisk's fatty acid chemistry. None of these people were working together in any coordinated sense, and yet each contribution became a necessary rung in a ladder none of them could see the top of. European regulators granted approval in 2009. The United States followed in January of 2010, and liraglutide entered clinical use under the Victoza name, becoming the second GLP-1 receptor agonist ever approved, and the first built directly from a modified version of the human hormone rather than borrowed wholesale from elsewhere in nature. For patients, the practical difference mattered enormously. A once-daily injection rather than twice-daily dosing, timed carefully around meals, meant meaningfully less day-to-day burden, woven into an already demanding chronic condition. It meant a therapy easier to sustain consistently across months and years, which matters enormously in a disease managed not in single dramatic interventions, but in the accumulated discipline of thousands of ordinary days. There was something else, too, quietly emerging from these trials, almost as a side note to the primary results doctors and regulators were focused on. Alongside improvements in blood sugar control, many patients using this new medicine were also losing a modest amount of weight. Not the drug's intended purpose, not the reason it had been developed or approved, but a pattern that kept appearing, trial after trial, consistent enough that it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. Researchers understood, even then, that GLP-1's influence on appetite, the same gentle quieting effect we discussed all the way back in this story's second chapter, was almost certainly responsible. Nobody yet knew how significant that side observation would eventually become. It sat, for now, as a footnote in the data. A small detail, easy to overlook, that the rest of this story would eventually return to in a way nobody at Novo Nordisk could have fully anticipated in the early 2000s. And yet, even at half a day's duration, this still was not the end of the search. Once daily was a real improvement over twice daily. But researchers, chemists, and the pharmaceutical companies funding this entire line of inquiry had already begun to wonder, almost as soon as liraglutide's trials were underway, how much further the same basic strategy might be pushed. If a single, carefully placed fatty acid chain could stretch GLP-1's presence in the bloodstream from minutes to half a day, was there a version of the same idea, refined further, engineered more precisely, that could stretch it even longer? Not once a day, but once a week. A single injection, and then nothing more to remember, nothing more to time around meals, for 7 full days at a stretch. Think for a moment about what that difference would actually mean for someone living with this every single day of their life. Once daily dosing is manageable, but it is still a task that must be remembered without fail every single morning or evening for years on end. One more small obligation woven permanently into an already demanding routine. A weekly injection asks something categorically smaller of a person's life. 52 moments a year, rather than 365. The difference sounds modest, described in numbers. Lived, day after day, across a lifetime managing a chronic illness. It is not modest at all. It was an ambitious question. It would take years of additional chemistry, additional trials, and one further insight into exactly how a modified GLP-1 molecule could be made to bind even more securely to its albumin carrier. Before that question had a real answer, that answer would eventually carry a name most people listening to this story already know. We'll reach it next. Some questions, once answered, don't end a search. They simply raise its ambition. Liraglutide had proven that a modified version of the human GLP-1 molecule, carrying a small fatty acid tail, could bind to albumin in the bloodstream and extend its presence from a fragile minute or two to something closer to half a day. That was, by any reasonable measure, a genuine triumph. It was also, almost immediately, treated by the researchers who achieved it as a beginning rather than an ending. If one fatty acid chain could bind the molecule a matter of hours, the obvious next question, the question that had been sitting quietly underneath the entire Liraglutide program from very early on, was how much further the same underlying principle could be pushed. Not hours this time, days, ideally a full week. There is a particular kind of ambition that only becomes visible once an earlier goal has already been met. Nobody sets out at the very beginning of a research program expecting to solve a problem completely on the first attempt. Progress in a field like this tends to arrive in increments, each one revealing the shape of the next increment still waiting beyond it. Liraglutide's success didn't feel, to the researchers who achieved it, like an ending. It felt like proof that the underlying strategy worked well enough to be worth pushing further, harder, toward a target that would have seemed almost fanciful only a few years earlier. This is where the chemistry becomes genuinely difficult, in a way that's worth understanding before we get to the result. Extending a molecule's half-life doesn't scale in a simple, linear way, where each additional modification buys you a proportional, predictable amount of extra time. The relationship is closer to something exponential in its difficulty. Getting from 2 minutes to half a day required real ingenuity, but it was, in a sense, the easier half of the problem. There was enormous room for improvement, and almost any meaningful protection against rapid enzymatic breakdown was going to represent a dramatic gain. Getting from half a day to a full week is a different kind of challenge entirely. By that point, the easy gains have already been claimed. What remains requires a far more precise, far more deliberate kind of engineering, where small imperfections that liraglutide's chemistry could tolerate become disqualifying at the longer timescale being attempted. Think of it the way an engineer might think about squeezing additional efficiency out of a machine that has already been carefully optimized once. The first round of improvements is usually the easiest. Obvious inefficiencies, low-hanging fruit, changes that yield large gains for relatively modest effort. Every subsequent round of refinement costs more and yields less, because the easy problems have already been solved, and what remains are the genuinely stubborn ones. Semaglutide's chemists were not starting from a blank page. They were starting from an already well-optimized molecule and being asked to find still more efficiency inside a system that had already been squeezed once. Novo Nordisk's chemists approached the problem the way careful engineers usually do, not by abandoning what had already worked, but by refining it further in several places at once. The fatty acid attachment strategy that had given liraglutide its half-day stability was kept, but built out considerably. A longer, more elaborate fatty acid structure this time, connected to the peptide backbone through an additional linking piece designed specifically to make the connection to albumin even more secure, even harder for the body's ordinary clearance mechanisms to interrupt. Alongside that, researchers made one further small adjustment to the peptide's own structure, at a different position along its chain than the changed liraglutide had relied on, adding an extra layer of resistance against the enzyme that had haunted this entire story from its earliest pages. The same DPP4 that dismantled native human GLP-1 within a minute or two of its release. None of these individual changes, described in isolation, sound especially dramatic. A longer fatty acid chain, an additional connecting piece, one more small substitution in the amino acid sequence. And yet the cumulative effect of these careful compounding refinements was extraordinary. Where liraglutide's modified molecule persisted in the bloodstream for something on the order of half a day, this new version persisted for approximately a week. A difference not of degree but of kind, transforming what a patient's relationship with the medication could actually look like. This molecule would become known as semaglutide. It is worth pausing here because we have now finally arrived at the actual chemical center of the story this documentary set out to tell. Semaglutide is not identical to Exendin 4, the peptide Eng found in the Gila monster's venom decades earlier. It descends more directly from the human hormone itself, carried forward through Mojsov's original sequencing work and refined through liraglutide's fatty acid innovation before reaching this further, more ambitious extension. But the underlying story both molecules tell is, at its heart, the same one. A fragile human signal, disappearing within minutes of its release. A search spanning decades and multiple continents for some way to make that signal last. And an eventual answer arrived at along two different paths, one borrowed from an unlikely desert animal, one engineered painstakingly by chemists working directly from the human molecule itself, both converging on the same essential outcome, a version of GLP-1's careful, glucose-dependent influence sustained long enough to actually matter. Two paths, two very different kinds of patients, one rooted in observation, the quiet noticing of something already perfected by evolution, the other rooted in construction, the deliberate incremental engineering of something that had never existed in nature at all. It would be tempting to declare one path more remarkable than the other, but that temptation is worth resisting. Both required years most of us would find difficult to sustain. Both demanded a tolerance for failure that most professions never ask of the people working within them, and both, in the end, arrived at medicines capable of changing the trajectory of a disease that had shortened and complicated human lives for as long as medicine has kept records of it. The development path that followed will, by this point in the story, feel familiar in its shape, even as the scale of it grew considerably larger than anything that came before. Years of laboratory testing preceded the first human trials. Early phase studies established safety and appropriate dosing, the same cautious, incremental process every medication in this story has passed through before advancing further. Then came the large-scale trial program. And here, the scale genuinely was larger than what liraglutide's own development had involved. Novo Nordisk's phase III program for semaglutide, generally referred to by researchers under the SUSTAIN name, ultimately enrolled more than 8,000 adults with type 2 diabetes spread across multiple separate trials, each examining a different facet of the drug's performance, how it compared to other diabetes medications already on the market, how it performed as an add-on therapy alongside treatments patients were already using, how it behaved across different populations and different starting points in the progression of the disease. 8,000 people, each one a real patient, agreeing to participate in a process that would take months or years of their life, measured in appointments and blood draws and careful documentation, in the hope of contributing to something that might, eventually, help far more people than themselves. Multiply that number across every trial this story has already described, and the true scale of what stands behind a single approved medication starts to come into focus. Thousands of patients in the Exenatide trials years earlier, thousands more across Liraglutide's lead program, now thousands more still across Semaglutide's SUSTAIN trials. Tens of thousands of people across 2 decades choosing to participate in a process most of them would never see fully completed, contributing data that would eventually shape treatment for millions of patients they would never meet. There is a kind of quiet, distributed generosity in that fact, easy to lose sight of amid the chemistry and the corporate names. An enormous collective act made up of individually small, largely unrecognized contributions. One trial within that broader program deserves particular attention because it changed the conversation around this entire class of medicine in a way none of the earlier studies quite had. Published in 2016, this trial, enrolling more than 3,000 adults with type 2 diabetes who also had established cardiovascular disease, was designed to answer a question that mattered enormously to doctors and patients alike, well beyond simple blood sugar control. Did this medication actually reduce the risk of the things diabetes patients fear most in the long run? Heart attacks, strokes, death from cardiovascular causes, which remains even now one of the leading ways diabetes shortens and complicates human lives. The results were significant enough to matter well beyond the immediate scientific community. Patients receiving semaglutide showed a meaningful reduction in the combined risk of cardiovascular death, non-fatal heart attack, and non-fatal stroke compared to those receiving standard care without it. This was not simply a drug that made a lab value look better on a chart. This was a drug that appeared to be doing something with real weight in patients' actual lives, extending years, preventing the kind of catastrophic cardiac events that diabetes patients and their doctors had spent decades trying, with limited success, to hold at bay. It is worth imagining what a result like this actually means for the people behind the numbers. A reduction in cardiovascular risk of this magnitude spread across a population as large as the trial itself translates into real heart attacks that didn't happen, real strokes avoided. Ordinary people, parents, spouses, grandparents managing a chronic illness they never asked for, living years they might not otherwise have had without ever knowing precisely which specific catastrophe their medication had quietly helped them avoid. That is the strange, invisible nature of preventive medicine at its best. Its successes are, by definition, the disasters that never happened, the version of someone's life that simply continued on, uneventfully, because a risk was reduced before it could become a tragedy. Consider what it means for a medication to cross that particular threshold. Plenty of drugs can improve a measurable number: blood sugar, cholesterol, blood pressure. without ever being proven in a rigorous controlled trial to actually reduce a patient's risk of dying or suffering a major cardiac event. That gap between improving a number and improving an actual outcome is one of the most important and most difficult gaps in all of the clinical medicine to close. Semaglutide had closed it. Not in theory, not in a smaller, less rigorous study easily dismissed, in a large, carefully controlled trial, published in one of medicine's most respected journals, standing up to the scrutiny an extraordinary claim like this demands. By this point in its development, semaglutide was not simply another entry in a growing category of diabetes medications. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most significant advances the field had seen in years. On December 5th, 2017, the United States Food and Drug Administration approved it, the brand name chosen for this new medicine, the name that would, in the years ahead, become more widely recognized than perhaps any other pharmaceutical name in modern memory, was Ozempic. There it is. The name from the very beginning of this story finally fully arrived. Not a hint, not a foreshadowing, not a distant destination glimpsed from far away. The actual medicine, approved, named, ready to be prescribed to actual patients living with type 2 diabetes, its lineage running backward through Novo Nordisk's chemistry, through Liraglutide, through Moisov's foundational sequencing, and, however many careful, deliberate engineering steps removed, tracing its conceptual origin all the way back to a fragile hormones dilemma that a desert lizard had already solved in its own body for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this. No one patient, on the day they picked up their first prescription, would have known any of that. Why would they? A name on a box, a number written on a prescription pad. The overwhelming majority of pharmaceutical history is invisible to the people who benefit from it, and that is, in its own way, exactly as it should be. Medicine at its best asks nothing of the patient except that it work, quietly, reliably, without requiring them to first understand the decades of chemistry and clinical trials sitting silently behind it. There is a kind of mercy in that invisibility, if you look at it the right way. A patient managing type 2 diabetes does not need to know about Rothman's Venom observations, or Eng's unfunded curiosity, or Moisov's painstaking sequencing, or the particular fatty acid chemistry that finally stretched a fragile hormone's presence from minutes to a full week. They only need the medicine to work, week after week, quietly doing its job in the background of an ordinary life. The decades of struggle that made that quiet reliability possible are, by design, meant to disappear into the background, visible only to someone willing to go looking for them, the way this story has. But we have spent this entire story doing something most patients never have reason to do, tracing the invisible chain all the way back. And having done that, it becomes almost impossible not to feel the weight of it, standing here at this particular moment. A name has finally arrived. Behind it, an entire unlikely history, quiet, patient, at times almost accidental, waiting to be recognized for what it actually was. Approved for glycemic control in adults with type 2 diabetes, administered once a week. Sit with that dosing schedule for a moment and measure it against everything this story has already walked through. Twice daily injections for Byetta, timed carefully around meals, a real and recurring burden woven into the most ordinary hours of a patient's day. 730 separate moments a year requiring attention and discipline. once daily for Victoza, an improvement, but still 365 separate obligations annually, never fully allowed to be forgotten. And now, with Ozempic, 52. A single injection, once a week, and then nothing more to remember until the same day arrived again. 730, 365, 52. Set those three numbers side by side, and you are looking at more than a dosing schedule. You are looking at more than 20 years of accumulated chemistry, trial design, and institutional patience, each number representing a genuine, hard-won reduction in the burden a chronic illness places on a person's ordinary life. Nobody achieves a drop like that quickly. Nobody achieves it by accident either. Not this time. Everything about this final number was earned, deliberately, refinement by refinement, by people who understood exactly what they were chasing and exactly why it mattered. This is worth returning briefly to that unglamorous laboratory in the Bronx, more than 2 decades earlier. Fluorescent light, linoleum floors, a clinician running one more assay on a Tuesday afternoon that felt, at the time, like any other. Everything this story has traced since that moment. The patent nobody at the VA wanted. The small San Diego biotech that took the risk. The partnership with a much larger company that made real clinical trials possible. Byetta's approval in 2005 as the first drug of its kind ever to reach a pharmacy. All of it led, however indirectly, to this. A weekly injection, a household name, a drug now being prescribed to millions of people who have never heard of Exendin 4, never heard of Joneng, and certainly never imagined that any part of the medicine keeping their blood sugar under control began, decades earlier, inside the mouth of a slow-moving desert lizard that spent 95% of its life underground. The distance between those two images, a Gila monster easing itself between two sun-warmed stones, and a household name medication prescribed to millions, is, on its face, almost impossible to reconcile. And yet, every step of the path connecting them was real, documented, traceable, one careful decision and one patient researcher building directly on the last. There was no shortcut here, no single miraculous leap from lizard to blockbuster drug. Only a very long chain of ordinary, unglamorous effort, each link forged by someone who had no way of knowing, at the time, how far the chain would eventually reach. For a while, Ozempic existed in the world exactly the way its predecessors had, as a diabetes medication prescribed by endocrinologists, used by patients managing a chronic condition, largely unremarked upon outside the medical community that had followed its careful development for years. It did its job. It controlled blood sugar. It appeared, based on the evidence, to meaningfully reduce serious cardiovascular risk in patients who needed exactly that kind of protection. Picture that early period, briefly, because it will not last long, and it is worth noticing precisely because of how ordinary it still was. A doctor's office. A prescription written for a patient whose diabetes had not been well controlled on earlier medications. A conversation about dosing, about side effects, about the modest, unglamorous business of managing a chronic disease, one appointment at a time. Nothing about this scene in late 2017 or through most of 2018 would have suggested that this particular drug name was about to become one of the most widely recognized words in the English language, spoken as readily in casual conversation as any celebrity's name or any blockbuster film title. But there was something else happening in the data, quietly. The same something that had first appeared as a small footnote back when Liraglutide's early trials were still underway. Patients taking semaglutide across the sustained trials weren't just seeing their blood sugar improve, they were losing weight. Not the modest amount observed with liraglutide's trials years earlier, but something more substantial, more consistent, more difficult for anyone paying close attention to overlook. At first, this remained exactly what it had been with the earlier GLP-1 drugs. A secondary observation, worth noting in the clinical literature, but not the primary reason the medication existed or had been approved. Nobody involved in semaglutide's original development had set out primarily to build a weight loss drug. The entire multi-decade arc of this story, from a fragile hormone's frustrating half-life, to a lizard's overlooked venom, to a Bronx laboratory, to two entirely different engineering strategies converging on the same result, had been oriented from its very first page around a different disease altogether. And yet the weight loss kept appearing, trial after trial, patient after patient, consistent enough, substantial enough, that it was no longer possible to treat it as background noise. There is a particular kind of moment in the history of any widely used medicine, easy to miss while it's happening, where a drug's identity quietly begins to split into two. On one side, the medicine exactly as it was designed and approved to be, a treatment for a specific, diagnosed condition, prescribed within careful medical guidelines. On the other, an emerging unofficial reputation, building not in laboratories or regulatory filings, but in ordinary conversation, gathering momentum faster than any clinical trial ever could. Ozempic, by the last months of the 2010s, was standing exactly at that fork, though almost nobody watching it closely enough at the time could have predicted how dramatically the second path was about to diverge from the first. Somewhere, outside the careful confines of clinical trials and regulatory submissions, in ordinary conversations between doctors and patients, and eventually far beyond that, into a much wider and much less predictable arena entirely, people were starting to notice. That noticing would not stay quiet for long. We'll turn to what happened next. Word, in medicine, rarely travels through official channels first. It travels through conversation. A doctor mentioning something to a colleague, a patient mentioning something to a friend, small observations accumulating in the space between formal publication and public awareness, long before any headline captures what's actually happening. In the years immediately following Ozempic's 2017 approval, that quieter kind of word was already beginning to move. Endocrinologists prescribing the drug for its intended purpose, glycemic control in patients with type 2 diabetes, were watching many of those same patients lose a meaningful amount of weight along the way, consistently enough that it became difficult to describe as incidental. Some physicians treating patients who did not have diabetes at all, but who struggled, as so many people do, with weight that resisted diet and exercise alone, began to wonder whether the same mechanism might help them too. This is how off-label prescribing usually begins, not with a company's marketing campaign, but with individual physicians working directly with individual patients, applying a drug's demonstrated biological effect to a related problem it wasn't originally approved to treat. It is a legal and, within careful medical judgment, an entirely normal part of how medicine evolves. Long before any regulatory body formally expands a drug's approved use, doctors are often already using their own clinical judgment to help the actual patients in front of them. Consider what this actually looked like from inside an ordinary medical practice during these years. A patient without diabetes, perhaps managing high blood pressure or joint pain, worsened by excess weight, asking a doctor whether this medication they'd read about might help. A physician, aware of the growing body of evidence, but working ahead of any formal approval for this specific use, weighing the decision carefully against what was already known about the drug's safety profile from years of diabetes trials. This was not reckless experimentation. It was medicine proceeding the way it often does, cautiously, case by case, ahead of the paperwork that would eventually catch up to what clinical experience was already beginning to show. Novo Nordisk, meanwhile, was pursuing something more formal. Even as Ozempic was becoming established as a diabetes treatment, the company had already begun investing in a dedicated research program to answer a much more direct question than off-label prescribing ever could. Could semaglutide, at a different dose, be developed and approved specifically as a weight management medication in its own right? This was, in its own way, a significant strategic decision, and not an entirely obvious one at the time. Pursuing a full, separate approval pathway for an obesity indication meant committing to another extensive trial program on top of everything already invested in the diabetes indication. Years more of research, years more of cost, with no guarantee that regulators would ultimately agree the evidence justified a new approval. Companies do not undertake programs like this lightly. That Novo Nordisk chose to pursue it formally rather than simply allowing off-label use to continue growing on its own reflected a genuine institutional confidence that the effect being observed in diabetes patients was significant, reproducible, and worth the considerable additional investment required to study rigorously. Before we reach that answer, one more small milestone deserves a moment of its own. In September of 2019, semaglutide reached patients in an entirely new form. Not an injection at all, but a tablet, taken by mouth. Marketed as Rybelsus, this was the first oral GLP-1 receptor agonist ever approved in the United States, a genuine engineering achievement in its own right. Peptides like semaglutide are, under ordinary circumstances, destroyed almost instantly by the digestive system before they can ever reach the bloodstream intact, which is precisely why every GLP-1 medicine before this point had required injection, bypassing the stomach entirely. Making an oral version work required an entirely separate line of chemistry, a specialized absorption enhancer developed to protect the fragile peptide just long enough for a small fraction of it to cross into the bloodstream before the stomach could break it down. Think back for a moment to just how far this represents a full circle kind of problem solving. The entire story so far has been about protecting a fragile peptide from being broken down too quickly once it reaches the bloodstream. Now, with an oral formulation, researchers faced a related but distinct challenge: protecting that same fragile peptide from being destroyed before it ever reached the bloodstream at all, during the brief, hostile passage through stomach acid and digestive enzymes that destroys the vast majority of any peptide taken by mouth. It is, in its own way, one more small chapter in the same overarching theme this entire documentary has traced. A fragile molecule, and the patient layered ingenuity required to keep it intact long enough to matter. It was a smaller milestone than the ones still to come in this story, but it is worth naming because it captures something true about this entire field by this point. Even after reaching a weekly injection, researchers were still finding new frontiers of convenience worth pursuing. The larger transformation, though, was still ahead, and it began with a dedicated trial program built specifically around obesity rather than diabetes as its primary focus. This program tested semaglutide at a higher dose than the one used for diabetes management in participants who did not necessarily have diabetes at all, but who met clinical criteria for obesity or significant overweight. Across several large trials, enrolling thousands of participants combined, the results were, by the standards of weight management medicine up to that point, startling. Participants receiving semaglutide lost on average a substantially greater proportion of their body weight than anything achieved by earlier generations of weight loss medication, results measured not in a few scattered pounds, but in a percentage of total body weight that, for many participants, meaningfully changed their health profile, their mobility, and their relationship with the condition that had often followed them for decades. Picture the actual range of people enrolled in trials like these. Not an abstract population, but individuals who had in many cases spent years or decades attempting weight loss through diet, exercise, and previous medications, watching that weight return again and again despite genuine sustained effort. Obesity, researchers had come to understand with increasing clarity by this point, is not simply a matter of willpower or discipline. It involves complex hormonal and neurological regulation of hunger and energy balance, precisely the kind of system this entire story has spent so much time examining. For many participants in these trials, watching a medication succeed where years of their own effort had repeatedly fallen short was not simply a clinical result. It was the first time some had experienced a treatment that seemed to work with their body's own signaling, rather than against a body that seemed determined to resist every previous attempt. To understand how significant this was, it helps to remember the graveyard of earlier weight loss pharmaceuticals this field had already passed through. Decades of attempts, many of them eventually withdrawn from the market entirely due to safety concerns, had left both doctors and the public deeply skeptical that any medication could produce substantial, sustained weight loss without unacceptable risk. Semaglutide's obesity trial results didn't just add another option to that disappointing history. They arrived as something categorically different, supported by the same kind of rigorous evidence that had already established its cardiovascular benefit in diabetic patients, this time demonstrating an effect on body weight that dwarfed anything the field had reliably produced before. On June 4th, 2021, the FDA approved this higher dose version of semaglutide specifically for chronic weight management under a new brand name, Wegovy. Here, worth pausing on, is a detail easy to miss amid everything that followed. Ozempic and Wegovy are, at the molecular level, essentially the same medicine. Semaglutide, built through the same chemistry, tracing back through the same decades of research this story has already walked through in full. The difference lies mainly in dose and in the specific condition each is formally approved to treat. One name quietly working as a diabetes medication since 2017. Another name, newly arrived, explicitly built and approved for weight management. Two names, two approved purposes, one underlying molecule. And before long, the public would treat the distinction between them as far less important than either company or regulator ever intended. There is something worth reflecting on in that particular kind of confusion, because it says something about how differently the public and the pharmaceutical industry think about a medicine's identity. To a regulator, to a chemist, to the company that developed it, Ozempic and Wegovy are distinct products, approved for distinct purposes, carrying distinct labeling and distinct intended patient populations. To most of the public encountering these names for the first time through a friend's comment or a headline, they would very quickly become functionally interchangeable, both simply the drug, referred to almost as a single, unified cultural phenomenon rather than two separate regulatory approvals built on the same underlying chemistry. What happened next did not unfold at the careful, incremental pace the rest of this story has followed. It happened quickly, in a way almost nothing else in this entire history had. Word of mouth, by 2021 and into 2022, was no longer confined to conversations between doctors and patients. It had moved into a much louder, much less predictable arena. Social media, entertainment journalism, casual conversation at gatherings that had nothing to do with medicine at all. People were noticing dramatic, visible changes in the appearance of public figures, and speculation, then confirmation, then open acknowledgement began circulating widely. Public figures, some candidly, some more guardedly, began discussing their own use of semaglutide for weight loss. What had been, for its entire history up to this point, a quiet, methodical medical story, became, in a matter of months, one of the most talked about topics in popular culture. There is a particular rhythm to how a piece of medical news becomes a cultural phenomenon, and it rarely follows the pace of the science underneath it. A clinical trial result, published carefully in a medical journal, might take years to filter into broader public awareness under ordinary circumstances. What accelerated this particular story was something closer to a perfect convergence. Dramatic, visible physical results, a built-in audience of celebrities and public figures whose appearances are perpetually scrutinized, and a media and social media ecosystem perfectly built to amplify exactly this kind of before and after narrative at extraordinary speed. Once that convergence began, there was very little chance the conversation would stay confined to medical journals and doctors' offices for long. It is worth sitting with how strange that shift actually was, set against everything this story has already covered. A discovery that took 13 years to travel from an anomalous lab result to an approved medicine. A second molecule that took over a decade of further chemistry to reach approval. A third that required years more of increasingly sophisticated engineering to achieve weekly dosing. Decades, in total, of patient, unglamorous, frequently unfunded effort, compressed in the public imagination into a cultural phenomenon that seemed to arrive overnight, as though it had appeared from nowhere in particular. It had not appeared from nowhere. It had simply, finally, become visible to a public that had never been watching the decades of work that preceded this moment. Among the details that spread widely during this period was a phrase that would come to define much of the public conversation around these medications: food noise. The term described something many patients had struggled to articulate clearly before hearing someone else name it first. A near constant, low-level mental preoccupation with food that many people carry through an ordinary day, without ever fully recognizing it as separate from normal hunger. Thoughts about the next meal, negotiations with oneself over whether to eat something and how much and when. A kind of persistent background hum that, for many people struggling with weight, had quietly shaped decades of daily life without ever having a name. Imagine for a moment carrying a quiet, near constant undercurrent of thought about food through every single day of your life, so consistently that you had long since stopped recognizing it as unusual, simply assuming that this was what everyone's mind sounded like, that this negotiation with oneself over every meal was just an ordinary part of being human. And then, imagine that undercurrent one day, simply going quiet. Not through effort, not through some new act of discipline, finally taking hold after years of failed attempts. Simply quiet, the way a room feels different the moment you notice a background hum you'd stopped consciously hearing has finally stopped. Patients taking semaglutide in large numbers reported that this hum simply went quiet. Not through willpower, not through discipline summoned from somewhere new, through a hormonal signal arriving in a part of the brain we discussed all the way back near the beginning of this story. The same quiet influence on appetite and attention that human GLP-1 has always exerted, now sustained long enough at a high enough level to produce an effect many patients described as genuinely life-altering, extending well beyond the number on a scale. The phrase moved from patient communities and specialized corners of the internet into truly mainstream awareness by 2024, helped along considerably when a prominent television personality devoted a widely watched special to the subject of weight loss medications, speaking candidly about her own experience with exactly this quieting effect. That single moment did more to bring the phrase food noise into everyday vocabulary than years of quieter patient testimony had managed on its own. A reminder of how unevenly public attention distributes itself, often arriving not when something is first true, but when someone sufficiently visible finally says it out loud. By 2022, a year some in the industry would later half-jokingly describe as the year this particular drug took over public consciousness entirely, demand had grown so dramatically that supply simply could not keep pace. In August of that year, Ozempic was formally added to the FDA's drug shortage list. Wegovy, manufactured through much of the same supply chain, followed a similar pattern. This is worth sitting with carefully because it is where the story's warmth begins to develop a genuine, uncomfortable edge. The patients this medication had originally been built for: people managing type 2 diabetes, people whose cardiovascular risk this drug had been rigorously shown to reduce, people for whom this was, in the fullest sense, a matter of long-term health and safety, began in some cases struggling to fill their own prescriptions. Pharmacy shelves that would ordinarily have held a steady, predictable supply were, at times, simply empty, as manufacturing capacity that had been calibrated for a smaller, more specialized diabetes market strained under demand from an enormous new population using the same medication for a different purpose. It was not that weight loss itself was an illegitimate reason to use this medicine. Wegovy, after all, had been rigorously tested and approved for exactly that use. It was the sheer scale and speed of the shift that the supply chain had never been built to absorb. Picture for a moment the specific and quietly painful position this created for an ordinary diabetic patient. Someone who had been using this medication responsibly for years, exactly as prescribed, managing a serious chronic disease, only to find themselves calling pharmacy after pharmacy, unable to locate a refill of a medication whose absence carried real, measurable health risk for them specifically. This was never a story where any single group of patients was in the wrong. It was a story about a supply chain built cautiously and deliberately over years for a specific, well-understood market, suddenly asked to serve a population many times larger, with almost no warning and no realistic way to expand fast enough to meet it. Into that gap stepped an entire secondary industry that had not existed in any meaningful form only a few years earlier. Compounding pharmacies, facilities legally permitted, under specific circumstances, to prepare customized versions of a medication, particularly during an officially declared shortage, began producing their own versions of Semaglutide, filling a demand the branded manufacturers could not. Telehealth companies built entire business models around prescribing and shipping these compounded versions with minimal friction. Medical spas, wellness clinics, and online providers of every description entered a market that, within the space of roughly 2 years, had grown from a specialized diabetes therapy into a multi-billion-dollar industry touching entertainment, fashion, food service, and public health policy all at once. The shortages would, in time, ease, manufacturing capacity gradually expanding to meet a demand that had once seemed impossible to satisfy, years after the crunch first began. But for a meaningful stretch of time, one of the defining medical stories of the era was also, quietly, a story about access, about who could reliably obtain a medication that had rapidly become one of the most sought after in the world, and who, through no fault of their own, sometimes could not. Restaurant chains began quietly reconsidering portion sizes and menu offerings. Food and beverage companies began developing entire product lines explicitly marketed toward people using GLP-1 medications. Fashion commentary began discussing changing body ideals in the same breath as a prescription drug name. A molecule discovered by accident in the venom of a slow-moving desert lizard had, by the early 2020s, become a subject of conversation in boardrooms, gossip columns, and dinner tables that had nothing whatsoever to do with medicine. Consider, too, how unevenly this transformation touched different corners of the economy. An entire industry built around dieting, weight loss coaching, and portion-controlled meal delivery found itself reconsidering its own future in light of a single injection that seemed to accomplish for many people what years of behavioral programs had struggled to sustain. Grocery chains reported measurable shifts in purchasing patterns among customers known to be using these medications. Smaller baskets, less snack food, different categories of item altogether. None of this had been part of any pharmaceutical company's original marketing plan. It emerged organically and rapidly from millions of individual changes in individual households, aggregating into patterns large enough for entire industries to notice and respond to within the space of a couple of years. There is a particular kind of vertigo in tracing a story this far, from where it began to where it arrived. A Gila monster, indifferent to all of this, still moving slowly between sun-warmed stones in a desert that has not changed appreciably in millions of years, and an almost unimaginable distance away in every sense that matters. A cultural and economic phenomenon, reshaping industries that had no connection whatsoever to venom, or reptiles, or the quiet laboratory in the Bronx, where this entire chain of events first began. It would be easy, standing at this particular point in the story, to let the wonder of that distance be the last word. The scale of it really is remarkable. An accidental discovery, patient and unglamorous for the better part of 3 decades, suddenly becoming one of the defining medical and cultural stories of its era. But wonder on its own would be an incomplete way to end this chapter, because something else was becoming visible during this same period of explosive growth. Something quieter and more sobering than the headlines were generally inclined to dwell on. rapid, substantial change to any human body. However it's achieved, however beneficial its primary effect, rarely comes without some kind of cost. The Gila monster's own biology, the very thing that made this entire story possible, offers its own quiet warning on this point if you think carefully about it. Its extraordinary ability to fast for months at a time did not evolve without consequence to its own physiology. It evolved as one very specific, very deliberate trade-off among many, refined over an almost unimaginable span of evolutionary time, tuned precisely to its own body, its own needs, its own pace of life. Human bodies, moving through weight loss at a pace and scale most had never previously experienced, particularly through a mechanism only recently understood, were about to reveal their own trade-offs. Quieter than the headlines, easy to overlook amid all the wonder, but every bit as real, and every bit as important to understand honestly. That is where we'll turn next, return for a moment to the tale. Somewhere in the first hour of this story, we spent a long while examining a single unglamorous body part, the thick, fat-storing tail of a Gila monster, the reservoir that allows this animal to gorge once, rarely, and then live off that single meal for months at a time. What made that adaptation remarkable was never simply that the animal could store fat. Plenty of creatures store fat. What made it remarkable was the precision of it. Millions of years spent calibrating exactly how that reserve would be drawn down, exactly which tissue the body would sacrifice first, and which it would protect fiercely, no matter how long the fast continued. A fasting Gila monster does not simply waste away indiscriminately. Its body knows, with a precision no human dieter has ever consciously replicated, exactly what to burn and exactly what to preserve. The fat in the tail is spent first, and spent gladly. The muscle the animal needs to hunt, to defend itself, to eventually move again once food becomes available. That is protected, held in reserve, sacrificed only as an absolute last resort, if it's sacrificed at all. This is not luck. It is the accumulated result of an almost incomprehensible span of evolutionary refinement, tuned specifically to this animal's body, this animal's lifespan, this animal's particular relationship with scarcity. Think of everything that had to align across those millions of years for that precision to exist at all. Countless generations of Gila monsters, each one facing the same fundamental challenge: survive the long gap between meals or don't, with natural variation determining, generation after generation, which individuals happen to manage that gap most efficiently. Over an almost incomprehensible span of time, that slow, unthinking process of trial and consequence produced something that looks, from the outside, almost like deliberate engineering. A body that seems to know exactly what to spend and exactly what to protect. No single Gila monster ever chose this. No individual designed it. It emerged the way most of evolution's most elegant solutions emerge, from an enormous number of small unconscious trials, refined ruthlessly over time by nothing more sophisticated than survival and its absence. Human bodies, moving through rapid weight loss driven by these medications, do not have that same precision built in. This is worth stating plainly because it is the honest, necessary center of this final chapter, and because a story this full of wonder deserves to end with equal honesty about its costs. When a person loses weight quickly, through GLP-1 medications, through any other aggressive method, through illness, through any circumstance that creates a significant and sustained caloric deficit, the body does not draw exclusively from fat reserves the way a Gila monster's does. It draws from multiple tissues at once, fat certainly, but also, in meaningful and measurable amounts, from lean muscle mass. Clinical research examining this class of medication has found reductions in lean body mass that are genuinely significant. In some trial data, muscle loss amounting to somewhere in the range of 1/7 of total lean mass over the course of treatment, alongside the fat loss that was the intended primary effect. Picture what that actually means beyond the number itself. Muscle is not simply about appearance or about strength in some abstract, gym-oriented sense. It is the tissue that allows a person to rise from a chair without effort, to carry groceries up a flight of stairs, to catch their balance if they stumble, to maintain the kind of everyday physical resilience most people never consciously think about until it begins to erode. Losing it too quickly, particularly without deliberate effort to counteract that loss, can leave a person lighter on a scale, while quietly weaker, more fatigued, more vulnerable to injury than they were before treatment began, even as the primary numbers doctors track, weight and blood sugar, both continue to look like unambiguous success. There is something quietly important in that gap between what a scale shows and what a body can actually do. Two people can weigh exactly the same amount and be in entirely different physical condition, depending on how much of that weight is muscle and how much is fat. A distinction a bathroom scale has no way of capturing, and one that matters enormously to how a person actually moves through their life. A number on a scale trending downward can look, on paper, like unambiguous progress, even while something less visible and more consequential is quietly eroding underneath it. This risk is not evenly distributed. Older adults, who already face a natural, age-related decline in muscle mass and strength known as sarcopenia, are particularly vulnerable to this compounding effect. A younger patient losing a portion of lean mass alongside substantial fat loss may have considerable physical reserve to draw on, room to rebuild what's lost. An older patient already navigating the ordinary erosion of muscle that comes with age has far less margin, and the consequences of significant strength loss in later life are not abstract. They are measured in falls, in fractures, in the loss of the kind of independence that allows someone to continue living safely and confidently in their own home. It is worth remembering, too, that the clinical trials establishing these medications' safety and effectiveness, for all their scale and rigor, did not always include older participants in numbers large enough to fully characterize exactly how this risk plays out across the full range of aging bodies. Medicine often learns the finer details of a treatment's long-term effects only after it reaches the much larger, much more varied population of real-world use. Patients decades older, patients managing multiple chronic conditions simultaneously, patients whose bodies simply weren't as thoroughly represented in the original research. That ongoing process of learning, well after approval, is not a flaw unique to this medication. It is simply an honest feature of how medicine continues to refine its understanding of any treatment long after the headlines about its approval have faded. Physicians who prescribe these medications have, as the evidence around this risk accumulated, increasingly emphasized deliberate countermeasures alongside treatment. Resistance, exercise, in particular, along with attention to adequate protein intake, both aimed at signaling to the body that muscle tissue should be protected and rebuilt even as fat reserves are drawn down. This is not a footnote to responsible use of these medications. It has become, for many prescribers, as central to the conversation as the medication itself, A recognition that the drug's remarkable effect on appetite and weight needs to be paired deliberately with effort aimed specifically at protecting the tissue. The drug's own mechanism doesn't naturally distinguish and preserve. There is a second, more visible cost that entered public conversation around the same time, one considerably harder to overlook because it shows up, quite literally, in a person's face. Faces do not typically carry a great deal of fat compared to the rest of the body, but the fat they do carry matters enormously to how a face looks, filling out the cheeks, softening the transition around the eyes and jawline, contributing to an overall sense of fullness that most people associate, often without consciously articulating it, with youth and health. When weight loss happens quickly and substantially, that facial fat is often among the first and most visibly affected. The result, observed widely enough by 2022 and 2023, that it acquired its own informal name. Ozempic face is a kind of rapid facial aging. Hollowed cheeks, more prominent under-eye hollows, skin that appears looser than a person's chronological age would suggest, the visible signature of volume lost faster than the skin's underlying structure could adjust to accommodate it. It is worth being precise about what is and isn't actually happening here, because the phenomenon is often discussed with more mystery than it deserves. Researchers examining this effect have generally concluded that it isn't a unique, exotic side effect specific to semaglutide or any single medication in this class. It is, more simply, what rapid, substantial weight loss does to a face, regardless of the method that produced it. A pattern observed for years among patients who lost significant weight quickly following bariatric surgery, long before GLP-1 medications existed at all. The skin and connective tissue of the face, like connective tissue throughout the body, has a certain natural elasticity, a certain capacity to adjust to gradual change. Asked to adjust to substantial volume loss over a period of months rather than years, that capacity is often outpaced, leaving a visible gap between how quickly the fat disappeared and how slowly the skin around it can adapt. The speed, more than the fact of the weight loss itself, seems to be the operative variable here. The same underlying pattern this entire final chapter keeps circling back to. A body given years to lose a given amount of weight has time to let its skin, its collagen, its underlying supportive tissue gradually accommodate the change, the way clothes might be taken in gradually, a little at a time, staying properly fitted throughout. A body losing the same amount of weight in a fraction of that time is, in effect, being asked to shed the equivalent of years of gradual change all at once, with no comparable time allowed for the surrounding tissue to catch up. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that this particular cost, cosmetic, visible, immediately obvious to anyone looking at a photograph, became one of the most widely discussed side effects of this entire medical story, considerably more discussed in ordinary conversation than muscle loss or bone density, concerns that arguably carry far greater consequence for a person's long-term health. We tend to notice and worry about what we can see, the quieter, more consequential costs, the muscle a person doesn't realize they've lost until they struggle with a task that used to be effortless, the bone density change that won't reveal itself until an injury years later, remain for most people considerably less visible and considerably less discussed than a change in the shape of a face. None of this is offered as an argument against these medications, and it would be dishonest at the end of a story this full of genuine wonder to pretend otherwise. For patients managing type 2 diabetes, the cardiovascular benefit demonstrated in rigorous trials is real and significant, extending years and preventing the kind of catastrophic events this story described earlier. For patients living with obesity, a condition that carries its own serious, well-documented health risks, a medication capable of producing substantial, sustained weight loss represents a genuine advance after decades of far less effective options. The trade-offs this final chapter has described are real, and they deserve to be taken seriously, discussed honestly, and managed deliberately. Not as a reason to dismiss what these medications have accomplished, but as a necessary, sobering complement to the wonder the rest of this story has rightly documented. Every genuine medical advance in this story's history has arrived carrying some version of this same tension. Insulin itself, when it first reached patients in the 1920s, transformed a fatal diagnosis into a manageable condition, and also required, from the very beginning, careful ongoing management to avoid its own risks, most notably the danger of blood sugar dropping too low. No powerful tool in medicine's history has ever arrived without some accompanying demand for care in how it's used. What matters in each case is not whether a trade-off exists, but whether it is understood clearly enough and managed carefully enough that the benefit is allowed to outweigh the risk for the people who need it most. There is, though, a deeper truth sitting underneath both of these costs, one worth naming plainly before we let this story rest. The Gila monster's extraordinary metabolic efficiency, its ability to draw down fat reserves precisely, protecting muscle, surviving months of fasting without the kind of collateral damage a human body incurs under comparable stress, did not happen quickly. It was built with almost unimaginable patience across millions of years of evolutionary pressure, refined generation after generation, until it fit this one animal's body and this one animal's particular relationship with scarcity, as precisely as a key fits a single, specific lock. When medicine borrowed the underlying signal behind that efficiency, first directly through Exendin 4 and later through an entirely engineered analog built from the human hormone itself, it borrowed the message, but not the millions of years of fine-tuning that had made that message safe in its original context for the body that evolved alongside it. This is worth stating as plainly as possible, because it is easy, after everything this story has celebrated, to lose sight of it. Borrowing a hormone's function is not the same as borrowing the entire evolutionary context that made that function safe. The Gila monster's fat-preserving, muscle-protecting precision evolved alongside its GLP-1-like signal as one integrated system, refined together across the same immense span of time. Human medicine, working on a timeline of decades rather than millions of years, has so far only managed to borrow one piece of that integrated system: the appetite-suppressing, blood sugar-regulating signal itself, without the accompanying equally ancient machinery that once ensured muscle was protected specifically, precisely, the way it is in the animal that originally evolved this solution. Used in a human body, moving at human speed, toward a human timeline measured in months rather than eons, that same signal becomes something closer to a powerful tool, without its safety manual fully written yet, remarkably effective at the specific job it was borrowed to do, and still, in some respects, being understood in real time alongside the millions of people now living with its effects. Nature's efficiency, it turns out, does not automatically transfer safely across species or across timescales. It has to be used deliberately, thoughtfully, with real attention paid to what a borrowed mechanism might cost a body it was never actually designed for. That is not a condemnation of this discovery. It is, if anything, a fuller, more honest way of appreciating it, recognizing that even the most remarkable gift borrowed from nature arrives without a guarantee that it will translate perfectly, and that real medical wisdom lies not in blind enthusiasm, but in careful, ongoing attention to exactly these kinds of trade-offs, for as long as people continue using it. And so, having walked this entire distance, from a fragile human hormone to a forgotten NIH observation, to a Bronx laboratory, to a bureaucratic refusal, to a small biotech gamble, to a household name, to a cultural phenomenon, to the quiet costs beneath it, it seems only right to end where we began. Close your eyes again if you still have them open. Let the room go quiet one more time. The desert has not changed. It rarely does. On any time scale, a single human life could meaningfully observe. The same heat presses down by day and lifts slowly after sunset. The same rocks hold their warmth long into the dark. And somewhere among them, indifferent to absolutely everything this story has just spent hours describing, a Gila monster is doing exactly what it has always done. Waiting, patient, unhurried, its tail carrying whatever reserve remains from its last rare meal, its body managing, with the same quiet precision it always has, a fast that might stretch on for months yet. It does not know its name, appears in medical textbooks. It does not know a peptide from its saliva, carries a designation, Exendin 4, assigned by a clinician in a hospital laboratory thousands of miles away, in a burrow it will never see, in a language it has no concept of. It does not know that laboratory's discovery eventually reached a small company in San Diego, or that company's gamble eventually reached a much larger one, or that partnership's patient work eventually produced a medicine called Byetta, approved on an April morning in 2005, the first of an entirely new class of medicine that would, within 20 years, reshape how millions of people manage disease, how the pharmaceutical industry approaches an entire category of illness, and how popular culture itself talks about bodies, health, and food. It does not know any of that. It was never trying to teach anyone anything. It was only ever trying to survive its own particular version of scarcity, the way its ancestors had survived theirs, for longer than human memory reliably extends. There is something almost consoling in that indifference, if you sit with it long enough. Nothing about this animal's existence has been altered by any of what humanity has done with its biology. It has not been thanked. It has not been changed. It continues exactly as it always has, entirely unaware that it sits, however unknowingly, at the beginning of a story that now touches millions of lives it will never encounter. There is a kind of quiet dignity in that, a reminder that the natural world does not owe its wonders to human recognition in order for them to be real or valuable or eventually transformative. That, perhaps, is the quiet truth this entire story has been circling from its very first sentence. Some of the most consequential discoveries in the history of medicine do not begin with ambition or ceremony or anyone setting out to change the world. They begin with a question about something the world had already decided to overlook, an animal too feared to study closely, a hormone too fragile to seem useful, a researcher too unglamorously positioned to be taken seriously by the institution meant to support him. They begin again and again, with someone patient enough to keep asking why, long after everyone else had stopped wondering. Before there was Ozempic, there was a lizard. It never asked to matter this much. It simply endured, the way it always had, patient and unhurried, in a desert that will still be here long after every name in this story has been forgotten. Eng's, Amelin's, Novo Nordisk's, Ozempic's own. The desert doesn't rush. It never has. And now, if you've made it this far, perhaps you don't need to either. Rest well.